go ahead and it's going. Let's go ahead and get our day started. If don't mind, to grab a seat. For those of you who are live with us, my name is David Bundy. I'm the president and CEO of Dean Dorton. I just want to welcome you to our 6th annual Board Oversight and Risk Management Seminar. So for 6 years, we've put together a venue, an event that kind of pulls together some topics for those involved with board oversight to try to highlight the risk. We think as advisors to our clients, sometimes highlighting risks or helping you identify how to find those risks is important. We have a great day lined up for you with some speakers and a panel discussion that I think that you'll appreciate. I'm going to go through that agenda. And again, those of you live, we also have several dozens, hundreds participating in this event virtually. So I want to welcome them as well. So the very first session, after I'm done with the introduction, will be Bill Combe and Jim Tenza. They'll be going over some board responsibility and trends in governance. There'll be a slight break after that. 9:20, there'll be a panel discussion, and that discussion is how to optimize the effectiveness of your board. And we think it's important, that relationship between management and the board and that role that the board plays for organizations to get that right. And so we've picked a good panel that will go through and discuss with you and share with you some ideas on how to optimize that. Another 10-minute break, and then the third session, current trends and best strategies for data breach response. Cybersecurity, we hear it all the time. And if we don't understand that risk and take that seriously, I think then all of our organizations can be at risk. So Guy, who leads our cybersecurity practice, and Colin Jennings from Squire Patton Boggs, a law firm that specializes in cyber, will kind of lead you through that discussion. So that's the morning. That's 3 hours of CPE for those who are looking for it. A couple of different housekeeping items. There is a chat feature on the right side of your screen for those of you who are participating virtually. So you can ask questions throughout. So those of you live, obviously, will have the opportunity to do so with the speakers here. But those of you who are participating virtually, use the chat feature. We're going to be monitoring that, and we'll make sure the speakers, the presenters, respond to your questions. There are polling questions for those of you who need CPE, and so you'll need to participate in those. We'll walk you through from instructions, but it's important that you do answer those so we can give CPE credit, and that's for both live and for those who are virtual. Also, those virtual, keep the presentation on your main screen. If you do shift that over, credit will be lost. And so if you start to open up other things, not that you would do that, but if you do, you could lose some CPE credit in that, doing that. The polls, here's the ways to participate. Text 22333, enter Dean Dorton, and then you can answer A or B to each one. That's on the text on your cell phone. Go to pollev.com. For those who just want to use the internet, again, Dean Dorton and join, and you'll be able to participate in those polling questions. We're not moving, guys. Well, I'll keep going, and before these guys come up, we do have a gift to give, and it's for those who are here or virtual at 10:20. We're going to select someone to win a Yeti cooler. So just to say thanks for coming in, so everyone will be able to participate and have the potential to win that. So right now I'm going to hand it over to Jim Tenza and Bill Combe to discuss their topic. Thank you guys again for coming. Not sure if it's working or not.
All right, good morning, everyone. I'm Jim Tenza, Director of Assurance Services, and I lead our internal audit practice at Dean Dorton. Bill Combe will be presenting with me. All right. And Here's our agenda for this morning. And really what we're trying to do is we're trying to set the stage for our panel discussion. So we're going to go over some of the board responsibilities and trends and talk a little bit about ESG, environmental, social, and governance. So we do have a polling question. So the reason we're starting with this is we want to make sure everyone knows how to use the polling information there. So if you can go ahead and answer what role you play in the organization. The other thing is we just want to make sure we know what the audience is here that we're talking to. And I do want to reiterate David's welcome. We do have, while there's about 25 of us here in person, there are 200 online. So we appreciate everyone being with us here this morning. It looks like a good mix of people here. Okay, so I'm going to start with board responsibilities. And every organization and company is unique, but the board of directors has mostly the same basic fundamental responsibilities, no matter what type of industry you're in, no matter how big or small the organization is. The board responsibilities are mostly the same, and that's what I'm really going to cover here are just the basic responsibilities. So the board, for example, is responsible for establishing the vision, mission, and purpose of the organization. This is something that's probably been done a long time ago at your organization, and it may the CEO and the owners may have been very involved, but really the board is responsible, and we recommend that the board occasionally look at that and make sure it's still on point. But one of the main responsibilities as the board is to hire and evaluate the CEO. So no matter what size organization you're in, that board has that responsibility. And in evaluating the CEO, what we typically see is an annual process. All of the board will weigh in on it, but the board will also get input from others within the organization through surveys. A lot of times the direct reports of the CEO, but other people within the organization, and some boards that I'm involved with, they actually get input from those outside the organization that may be key stakeholders. And along with that responsibility, the board also sets the salary compensation of the CEO. And they also will approve the compensation of other high-level executives in the organization. Most boards, especially those that are larger, will have a subcommittee, compensation committee, or an executive committee that will take over that responsibility to keep that information as confidential as possible. Another significant responsibility is the financial oversight. Typically, this is done by approving the budget and then monitoring budget to actual results throughout the year. But the board also has a responsibility to make sure that there's good internal controls over financial reporting. Most of the time, this is done through the external and internal audits. So the external auditors, internal auditors are supposed to report directly to the board. And again, a lot of times the board have a subcommittee, an audit committee that will deal with those external and internal auditors. But if your organization's a bit smaller and doesn't have audits done, then the board really does have responsibility to make sure financial information is accurate and there are controls in place. Board also is required to ensure there's adequate resources throughout the organization, and they're also responsible for setting the strategic plan. So setting the strategic plan is usually done every 3, 5, or 7 years, and the CEO and others within management are significantly involved, but it's really the board that's responsible for approving and setting that strategic plan. The board does delegate responsibilities to management. They're really to support the executives and their team, and so they work pretty closely, but if they delegate, they need to make sure that they are approving certain things, and they need to make sure that they understand that they're ultimately accountable to the stakeholders in the organization, which may be the owners or others. The only other item I wanted point out on this list is recruiting and orienting new board members and assessing board performance. The board is really responsible for finding replacements for people that roll off of the board. That's not a management responsibility. The board really needs to make sure that there's a good makeup on the board and they have good people in place, and they need to make sure that they go through an orientation with those new board members. And then the boards really should do some sort of self-assessment. Typically, annually, there's a process for them to assess how they're doing. It may be a survey or something like that, but annually they do need to do a self-assessment. And some of the other items on this list are largely done by the CEO, and they report to the board, and the board needs to approve those things. So those are the basic responsibilities. I did want to spend a few minutes on some of the trends that we're seeing at board levels, and these aren't necessarily the hot topics or the things that the boards are completely focused in on. So you don't see cybersecurity on this list, for example, but these are things where we see the trends are changing this year, going into next year, and we're seeing a different focus by the board. So for example, confronting and addressing volatility. There's a lot of volatility going on in companies right now. Some of it's caused by the 2020 election results. Some of it is because of the pandemic and coming out of the pandemic. And there's also a lot of change going on with gender and income inequalities. So there's a lot of changes going on in the political, economical, and social environment. And so the boards are starting to focus in on that and doing some things differently. An interesting thing from the pandemic is the roles of the board management. So I'm on several boards, and I know last year at this time it seemed like we were meeting with management weekly or every other week, and there's a lot of discussion about the operations and how things were changing. And because of that, things have become blurred as far as what the responsibilities are of the board and management. So a lot of boards right now are looking at, what are our responsibilities? What do we really need to be doing? Do we need to change some of the things? And so they're looking at that and what management's role are and making sure they've got that defined. The other interesting thing from the pandemic is, as you all know, a lot of organizations and companies have changed the way they do things. And a lot of organizations right now are trying to figure out, do we want to keep those changes going forward? The obvious one is working remotely. A lot of companies are still trying to decide, do we want to continue that? Or how do we want to do that? A lot of companies have changed the way they bring their product to market, the way they deal with suppliers, the way they deal with payments. So there's a lot of changes that have gone on, and organizations are trying to figure out which of those they want to continue to do on a more permanent basis. And so the board is working with management on that, trying to help them figure out, what do we really want to be doing and how do we want to do it. There's companies have a commitment to diversity, and the boards themselves also have that commitment, and the boards a lot of them are looking at the makeup of their board and trying to figure out, are they as diverse as they really should be? They're looking at the term limits, they're looking at the type of people they have on the board, and we're starting to see a lot of changes, bringing in some fresh faces. A lot of times on boards, you kind of see the same faces over and over. A lot of boards right now are looking at their term limits and the people they have on the board and the diversity of their board. One of the other areas of focus is the ESG, environmental, social, and governance. I'm not going to steal Bill's thunder. Bill's going to be talking about that in just a minute. The other thing I did want to touch on is the focus on human capital. So there's a significant amount of turnover going on in the workplace at all industries, all companies. And quite frankly, this is probably the greatest change in workforce that I've seen in my career. And there's a lot of people who don't want to return to work, that want to work remotely. There's a lot of people that want to come back and don't want to work remotely. And there are a lot of people that over this last year and a half have really been reevaluating what they want to do and what they want to focus on. So there's been a huge amount of turnover, and so boards are really concerned about the people in their company. Do they have the right mix of people? Do they have the right number of people? Also, there's a lot of concern about employee health and safety. And there's also concerns about employee engagement. So as people have worked from home, a lot of employees have become disengaged. So the board's looking at the amount of turnover and change that's going on in the workforce is just unbelievable. So the boards obviously are starting to focus in on that. Last few things here, accountability. There's been an increased commitment to a culture of ethics and corporate compliance. And board effectiveness. Like I was talking about, it's during the pandemic, the boards were meeting on a fairly different basis, maybe weekly, every other week. The boards, because of that, are looking at how effective they were doing that versus how they normally do things, meeting quarterly and having a set agenda. And so the boards are looking at, how often should we meet? What types of things should we cover? Are we as effective as we should be? And then the last couple things, their executive pay. I talked about the board needs to approve the pay of the CEO. Boards are looking at how they're evaluating the CEO and executives, and we're seeing a lot of boards tying compensation to things related to ESG. And then lately there's been a focus on tax transparency and making sure the company organizations filing the right tax returns, and those are available, and some boards are looking at those tax returns. So those are some of the trends. Again, we just kind of wanted to set a baseline here before the panel comes out to let everyone know some of the trends and responsibilities. And we encourage you, once the panel shows up, to ask some questions. We think we have a great panel that'll help address some of those trends and responsibilities. So now I'm going to turn it over to Bill to cover ESG.
All right, good morning. All right, ESG has its roots in Earth Day, which was established over 50 years ago, but most recently, ESG has gained a lot of momentum because of the pandemic and social unrest that our country has faced. This particular slide comes from, of all companies, a mining company, Arch Resources, but it depicts very well the three aspects of ESG. And we'll dive into those a little further. And whether you're new to ESG or if you're a 10-year veteran in this space, my hope is that you'll walk away with at least one new item you can take back to your organization. The foundation of ESG is built on 4 pillars. The first one being people, and Jim kind of touched on it when we talked about human capital, the importance of health and safety, diversity, wage equality, and just overall treatment of employees is housed under people. The next leg is our planet. We hear a lot about climate change. How many companies have you seen come out recently that say by 2050 we're going to be carbon free? We're going to have no carbon footprint. That sounds great, but who's going to hold them accountable? There's a lot of ESG metrics out there today that are totally false. And there's little to no assurance being done in that space. And we'll come back to that in a little bit because that's very important to us at Dean Dorton. So on the planet, greenhouse gas, how much water are you using? What are you doing with your land? Are you treating the earth well? Prosperity. How are you interacting with your communities? And I recently saw a presentation that was on point. Being a good steward in your community is not just writing a check to your local charity. It is rolling up your sleeves and getting to know your neighbors. Doing service hand in hand with them will give you a better understanding of what is going on in your community and not just hiding behind even the biggest check. So that is, I think, an important challenge in that area of prosperity. Governance. That goes without saying. Ethical behavior is paramount, and that is an important aspect of ESG. So just a quick rundown. I think this is a good list of items that companies can embrace. Not every one of these metrics is going to meet every company. It's up to you to determine the 2, 3, 4 metrics that resonate with your stakeholders, and that's really the beauty of ESG. Is as of now, there's not a lot of regulations around it, so you can be proactive in determining how you want to do that. But I will say, if you're a public company, there are some requirements that the SEC is about to promulgate, so there will be more rigor in that public company space. But it doesn't mean as a private company that you cannot be or should not be proactive as well. There's a lot of upside. So here's the SEC. We have new leadership, a lot of pressure from investors. Again, I think through the pandemic, this ESG focus has become paramount amongst investors, and they're expecting more transparency before they invest their money. And over in Europe, they're well ahead of the U.S. in setting requirements around ESG, so we see that as well. So the SEC has a climate and ESG task force, and through that, we do expect, before the year's out, to have some new required disclosures around human capital and climate control. We're not sure how long it will take. The SEC will allow a runway, but we are expecting those. What we don't know is, are we going to have a mini Sarbanes-Oxley where there'll be assurance requirements? Because over 20 years ago, whoever thought that audits of internal controls of public companies would be required? That never really came up in discussion. So who would have thought as we move forward that companies will have to go through some sort of rigor around these ESG disclosures? Because it's very clear in multiple studies there's a lot of fake information out there because it makes the company look good and no one's holding them accountable. So it would not surprise me over time, and maybe here sooner than later, that there could be some rigor and assurance around these disclosures. And we're not sure if that's going to be part of a 10K or it could be its own separate report that gets issued for public consumption. Standards, you may be thinking, we're all experts on what FASB, US GAAP, maybe even international standards on the financial side. What do we have on the ESG side? Well, 10 years ago, because of a lack of uniformity in these metrics, SASB, or Sustainability Accounting Board, was established. So that was only 10 years ago. This is a very young area. But with it, GRI and other standard bodies exist. It's kind of like the alphabet soup is running around, and we're starting to see some consolidation, because just like we see the benefits on the financial side, having uniform standards, even if it's two, one international and one in the U.S., is better than having, I think, all these different standard-setting bodies. And it's very difficult to corral all these ESG metrics into a uniform standard, so it is a very difficult, but something that is being evaluated. So assurance, what can we do on the assurance side? The AICPA does allow reviews and examination of ESG metrics. But like I said, will investors, rating agencies push the SEC to require some level of assurance around these disclosures that we're expecting here soon to get? For now, public companies are being proactive. We're going to see in the materials, Target has a 120-page annual report just on ESG. It's unreal the amount of effort Target, one of my favorite retail companies, has put into their focus on ESG. If you're a private company, again, I would challenge you to look out at similar public companies in your space and see what ESG metrics they're touting, because those probably will resonate with your stakeholders as well. Also, engage your bank. I expect that if I'm an investor in a bank, I'm going to be expecting, who are we loaning money to, and are they being good stewards of their community? What metrics are they sharing with us? Not only do I want their quarterly financials, I want these two metrics on at least an annual basis. And I want at least a review done, not only on the financials, but let's have an independent party review those ESG metrics as well. This is my personal opinion, but I think that's the direction we're headed. And if you're getting federal and state money, rest assured, state governments are discussing these topics as well, and it wouldn't surprise if you're going to get that grant, you're going to get those federal funds, you're going to be held to not only financial requirements, but some sort of ESG metrics. And if you're a nonprofit, use ESG to your benefit. Attract new investors, new parties by talking about your sustainability and what you're doing to promote your community and how you're being a good steward of the resources that you're given, including in the area of equity. So I mentioned Target. You can go out to their website. A lot of public companies have an ESG area. It's that important. I flipped this document quite closely, and it's interesting all the different ESG standards that they've baked in. Plus, in their 10K, they have a whole human capital discussion. So what does this mean? Let's see where the rubber hits the road. What are they touting from an ESG? Well, vendor relationship. In the past, we've done presentations on third-party risk. What vendors are you working with? It's the same aspect here. Do you want to work with a vendor that's not being a good steward of their resources and community? And Target goes a long way to creating a vendor code of conduct, and then they go out and do audits on their vendors to see if they're conforming to that code of conduct. In 2018, they did over 1,000 audits. They more than doubled that, or they about doubled that in 2019. That's very important. So they're looking at issues around health and safety, working hours, wage issues, and are these vendors working with other diverse suppliers? From a human capital, Target discloses their average hourly rate, plus they get into diversity items around staffing. And those items are all disclosed. On the environment side, as I note here at the bottom, they've done some limited assurance procedures around these environment aspects. Composting, donating of food. Plastic is a hot topic. If you've gone to Starbucks in the past couple of years, they're waning us off the plastic straw. You have to ask for it. So plastic is definitely a hot topic, and it is for entities like Target. Moving over to governance, and Jim did a good job discussing some of these items, but recently, based on some work we do with school districts, I read a book on the governance core school boards, and it resonates with every board, regardless of your industry. And when you look at the requirements of a governance mindset, it's all spelled out on this wheel. And I would challenge all boards, as you build your agendas, make sure you're looking at each of these prongs to make sure you've accounted for that. And again, Jim focused on a lot of these items. And we'll see in some of the studies where deficiencies in boards are hitting at these different prongs. All right. We're very thankful to have the Institute of Internal Auditors. They, a couple of years ago, worked with the University of Tennessee on building the 8 principles of governance for a board. If you think about this area, it's very nebulous. What is governance? It's very subjective. But having these principles gives us some items we can anchor to actually conduct audits. And at Dean Dorton, over the past couple of years, we have done governance audits. And it's much more effective when you can tie things back to principles. And we'll take a look at those. And what the University of Tennessee and the Institute is doing on an annual basis, they've created a scorecard for public companies, and it calculates a corporate governance index. So we'll look at that. There's definitely room for improvement. And the next 2 slides lists out the governance principles verbatim. But what's very important, and if you're interested in this document, it's a 26-page document, so it doesn't take too long to read, and it is out there free. But it gives you attributes of what that principle means, right? Principles can be very subjective, but like the first one, you want to have substantive board meetings. You want to make sure they're timely and that the agendas are substantive enough. that you have collaboration with management, and that you're working from an effective organization chart, that the organization is well defined and you have the right individuals involved. The second one speaks to involvement with the community, conflicts of interest are properly noted, and that the websites have proper governance information. Transparency is key. The third one gets into diversity and balancing needs. The last one is that long-term view. We do not want to get short-sighted at the board. You always need to be looking down the road at what's coming. And hopefully this event, coming to this each year, is a good reminder of what's out ahead and what discussions need to be discussed. And then here's the last four. So culture, utilizing internal audit, having a fraud hotline, make sure you have a strong tone at the top is that principle. You want to make sure that the information that you're receiving as a board, so if you're management, that you don't just randomly hand things out. It's well thought out, you vetted it, you have data integrity at your organization. You give it to the board, you give them time to ask questions. If there's follow-up, the CEO or applicable executive does so in a timely fashion. The last item gets into transparency, and then the last one really speaks to the policies and procedures that you have and opening yourself up to some periodic audit to assess the effectiveness of your governance. And then this is just a quick rundown. If you're assessing your board, these are some quick items that you should self-assess. Do we have this? And it's not just enough to say you have it, but is it meeting the requirements? Can we improve it? These all should be good discussion topics, and at least annually a good self-check. So the governance index, not flattering grades. I don't think any of us aspired to get a C+ or a B-. So there is some progress. These are public companies, and again, they're going through those different principles, and this is done independently. So what are we finding? There's a lot of bureaucracy that hampers effective governance. So trying to streamline things, make sure information is provided in a timely fashion. I see some interesting looks. So maybe you're dealing with that bureaucracy as a board. You are empowered to pull that apart. If you have to, start over. In our world, things change so quickly, and the last thing you need is bureaucracy standing in the way. You've got to be transparent. And of any word that I've mentioned, that we mentioned today, I bet transparency shows up the most. It is so important at all levels that you have the right optics and that information is shared very timely and transparent. And that long-term, we keep coming back, you got to have that long-term outlook. I know the pandemic may have caused us appropriately to look more short-term, but as we come out of this, we've got to look long-term and learn from the lessons like Jim mentioned. So some other things here that I thought were interesting is from a resource standpoint, do we have enough employees and are they getting ample training and the appropriate training? I think the board should ask those questions. That's very important from a human capital. So as we wrap up, before we talk about, it's always good to have action steps, and so as a board, what should you do? And if you're not part of a board but you're giving information to the board, I think these are still reasonable. But just to give you a couple examples of why ESG is so important, recently the SEC approved NASDAQ's proposal to require any listed company on NASDAQ to complete a board diversity grid by August of 22. Also, you have to note if at least 2 of your board members meet the diverse qualification. And I'm not going to get into all of that criteria, but if you decide not to meet that, and this is not, I wouldn't call this a requirement, this is an expectation, but if you don't meet that expectation, you're supposed to disclose why you don't feel the need to have a diverse board. So that could be quite painful to try to draft that. There's a transition period to meet those requirements. But that's an example of how important, at least in the public space, diversity is and at the board level. And then if you go out to California, back in 2018, many of you may have seen, there's a new law in the books in California. If you're domiciled and a public company in California, you must have at least one female board member. And they audit that each year to make sure you're conforming. And when that law came out, there were 25% of these public companies did not conform or weren't conforming. So over time, hopefully they've met that requirement. And if you're of a certain size, I think it may go up to 2 female members. So that, again, that's just a quick example of the type of regulations that are out there, particularly for public companies. But as we know from the past, things can trickle down from the public space into the private space. All right, so what should you do? So when we talk about a long-term plan, you've got to think about sustainability and baking in these ESG metrics. And I'm definitely not here to tell you which ones are relevant. You've got to discuss that amongst the board and management and think about what are these risks and how can we measure and hold management accountable to meeting these. And you've got to set targets, and again, it's that accountability at each, let's say each quarterly board meeting, we have ESG on the agenda, and we have a level of accountability. This isn't just something to talk about and feel good about and then forget about it. This is here, it's not going away. You've got to integrate it into your long-term plan. And how do you message it? This could really backfire. One, if you've got the wrong measurements, and then 2, you say you're doing something, but you're not really, you're not doing what you say. So you've got to be careful how you message. And don't just dive into the deep end of ESG and pick, 15 measurements because Target's doing it and you're in the retail space. You want to slow down and start slow, pick the ones that are most meaningful, and then over time things can change and you may adjust. But messaging is very important. And then risk assessments have to include ESG as a component, and those should be had at your risk committee discussions. And then ultimately, again, it comes back to communication and what platform are you going to use? If you're a public company and you've got these required disclosures, but are you also going to use your website and other communication channels? If you're a private company, you've got your website. You have other communication channels that you may want to utilize, but again, it's about being consistent, accountable, and not setting yourself up for failure. So we're 2 minutes from a break before we get the panel. I'm really anxious. As I was driving over from Lexington, I was like, I can't wait to see what our panel, those are always, to me, the highlight. So hopefully Jim and I have been a good opening act as we wait for our main event. Any questions or any quick comments? I don't know if we have anything from our virtual audience, which I should have acknowledged our virtual guests. Our information is right there. I welcome, and both of us welcome any emails, phone calls. We're actively at Dean Dorton doing a monthly blog on ESG. The most recent one that's coming out is why nonprofits should embrace ESG. There is so much information. I'll tell you, there's some great podcasts that you can look up, a lot of good articles. We're consuming all this and trying to distill it to something that you all can act on. So hopefully you take advantage of our monthly blog around ESG and talk to whether it's us or other service providers, your banks. Be proactive. You do not want to be reactionary and get bogged into measuring something that you could have been measuring and improving, and then you set yourself behind that proverbial 8 ball. All right, so I don't see any questions. I guess everyone's ready for a quick break, and then we'll be back in 10 minutes. Thank you very much.
Hey Devin, can you mute this mic real quick? Can you mute?
You booked a spacious Vrbo summer home with a pool big enough for the most epic cannonballs. But the thing they'll remember forever, the first
Hop Life?
Yes.
Is that a company?
Yeah,
Okay.
uh-huh.
Cool. Oh, we're live.
Okay, good morning, everybody. It is 9:20, so we'd like to start our panel. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Elizabeth Woodward. I am a consulting director at Dean Dorton, and I have a passion for board governance. So I am very excited to be here today to moderate this panel, who collectively have a ton of experience. So I will introduce them. To my immediate left is Tanya Jackson. Tanya is the Senior Vice President and Chief Product Delivery Officer for Lexmark International. She has been at Lexmark since its inception in 1991 in various management roles. I'm going to share the next thing with you, and I might be the only one here who's really interested in this, but I think it's so cool. She's the author of 5 U.S. patents, and that is something that you don't see every day.
Nerd.
She has served on numerous not-for-profit boards, including recently chairing the Urban League of Lexington Board of Directors, and she and I serve together now on the Bluegrass Airport Board. And Tanya also serves on a public company board, Hooker Furniture. Then on the other end, far end, we have Phoebe Wood. Phoebe has a long financial career. She retired. Her last job was as CFO and then as vice chairman of Brown Forman. After retiring, she formed Companies Wood, which is a consulting firm that advises and invests in startup companies. She serves as a member of several boards, including Investco, where she chairs the audit committee, Pioneer Natural Resources Company, Leggett & Platt, and PPL Corporation. She also is a previous board member of Coca-Cola and Oshkosh B'gosh. Then in our middle, we have Neil Ramsey. Neil is the president and CEO of Ramsey Quantitative Systems, which is a private investments firm. He's also the CEO of Conficare, which is a senior housing development company. During his career, he has worked with domestic and foreign multinational companies developing corporate strategies. He serves on the board of visitors of Vanderbilt's Owen Business School, and also he's on the board of Exos Life and Hop Life. So thank you all. All of our panelists can share perspectives both from serving on management reporting to a board and also serving on boards. So that is great. So we will just dive right into our questions. And I guess just a few housekeeping matters. We would love to have questions from the audience if you have any. I think you're supposed to submit them on the app. And we're going to go for an hour. And then there will be a break at the conclusion of this panel. So I'm going to start with you, Tanya, because you're on my immediate left.
Okay.
Can you share what you consider to be one of the best practices for a board?
Related to just managing risk in general?
Yes,
Is that
yes.
right? Where so yeah, I think we would all share the same, is that we would review the enterprise risk management process, which would include, the management looking at all of the short term, the longer term, and even the emerging risk. For me, one of the best practices is that there are owners assigned to the risk, because risk will exist. That's just reality, and you can avoid it, mitigate it, or a host of things that you can do about it. But who owns it, and how are they managing it? And then one of the things I'd like, because I operate in a world pretty of high risk in the supply chain area, is to review with the board what kind of success have you had in mitigating the risk? Because from board meeting to board meeting, different things happen, and there are always mitigation plans, and are you exercising them, and have you successfully been able to mitigate some of those risks?
Okay. Neil, same question to you.
I'm not going to approach it straight from the risk side. For me, it's best practices. I think first, it's very important that board members have real ownership. And what I mean by that is that I've been on a lot of not-for-profit boards where we have board members that don't give. You should be giving if you're going to believe in something. If it's a public or private company, I think you should be an owner. But I think ownership and a real stake in the platform is very important. So that's first for me. Second, I've also seen board members take up to 2 years to become relevant because they have such poor onboarding processes. So I think onboarding processes and the training, the indoctrination is really important. And third, which I've seen a lot of, is independence. Oftentimes boards get, they're a lot of friends and cronies, and the CEO ends up with a voice that is one. It's his. So I think it's very important that they're independent. So that's 3 sort of big picture best practices that I would say.
Thanks for the question, and hello, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be with you today. So I've got 2 comments. One that came out of COVID as a best practice, and one that I just use probably in every board, whether it's a for-profit or non-for-profit, whatever that is. The first is, remember that your board is a tremendous resource to you. Those of us who sit on boards recognize that we are there because we're supposed to be a resource. So use that well. What I have found as a best practice, using the construction of the agenda and the preparation for those board meetings really well so that you get people really aligned. Sometimes I've seen, and this is what Jamie Dimon at JP Morgan Chase does, he says, this is where we were the last time we met, here's where we are today, and then he ties it all to strategy. And so you might think about that as sort of a theme. But I would say using your time with your board extremely well is the best practice, and figure out the best way for you to be able to do that. The second thing, another very practical thing that came out of COVID when we were doing all of our board meetings on Zoom or Teams or whatever, the chairman, this has started with one chairman, and I spread it to all other boards, and it's now used at almost every board. And that is to call or have every single director or every single trustee, board member, comment if there's a vote or if there is something on which you're making, need to have a comment or a recommendation or a vote. It has been profoundly changing, because in some boards you have a pontificator, or you have people who tend to dominate. In this way, every single person gets a voice on a particular matter. And we always mix it up so that it's never always alphabetical or it's never whatever, but everybody has to speak on those critical issues. And that has made a real difference in the boardroom in terms of boardroom dynamics and every person having a voice. So that's a COVID-related best practice that I've now seen for Zoom meetings.
But do you think it'll continue when you go back to in-person?
It's been so powerful that I think it will, because it shuts down pontificators, and it allows even those people who are often very quiet. Sometimes the best ideas come out of people who are just listening intently and then have something very special to say. So I just, it's a practical, extremely practical, I'd recommend it to you.
Thank you. That's a great best practice. And I think we got to this, heard a little bit of this answer, but the next question is, what do you see as one of the most important roles of a board member? So I know I heard one of you say to be an advisor, but Neil, do you have anything to add?
I said this to Bill I guess to Jim. It's kind of unfair when you guys present on governance and ESG and then we're supposed to speak on this stuff. I was going to take screenshots and just say what you guys said. I think first and foremost is a company has to define their sustainable edge, their strategy, what it is that they do best and is defensible and sustainable. So I think as a board member, if a company doesn't do that, it's not clearly defined. A board member should drive that home as much as possible, because it's amazing how often companies get in ruts and actually don't define what it is that makes them great. So I think that's first. Second of all, and Phoebe said it, is make management listen and speak. I can't believe how many boards that quiet guy that has the good idea doesn't speak. And I think it's particularly true for not-for-profits. A lot of people are on for, I don't know if it's resume or they believe in the cause, but they don't speak up. And I think a board member not being afraid, whether it's to look dumb or to look aggressive or whatever it is, I think it's extremely important that they speak. And then, your CEO or whoever runs your business, your operations, will present a plan. Phoebe talked about Jamie Dimon. I think he does an amazing job of saying, this is what we're going to do. And then the board's job is to hold him accountable. He doesn't have to be held accountable because he does it. But I think a lot of CEOs aren't they're not forced to present a plan and then being held accountable to that plan. So those are the three things that I would say are really important for a board to focus on.
Okay. Phoebe, you want to go next?
So in corporate America, and I sit on more corporate boards than, and publicly traded corporate boards, probably the greatest role there of the board is to choose the CEO. And I've been on boards where there's been a failed transition, and it's hard. That's really hard if the transition from one CEO to another doesn't work, and how hard that is to fix that and to find the right person to lead the company, given the situation of the company at the time. And so I think that a board's number one role is to pick the leader of that organization well and to help that person be successful. I also think a second key thing is to set the strategy, to really help strategically with what is it that we're trying to achieve. And whether you're a nonprofit, a governmental agency, an university, academic board, or a for-profit board, getting the strategy right, understanding that competition, understanding what are the series of things that we need to be doing in all aspects of it, I think is really quite powerful. I also think one of the roles that I have, where I chair 2 audit committees and I chair 2 nom-gov committees, is to get the right people on the board, help find the right people on the board, and to help management avoid potholes. Especially in startups and in small companies, there are potholes, and you get someone with a lot of experience on the board that can help you identify where those potholes are and to avoid them. And so I really see that. Interestingly enough, in corporate America, and I see this more in corporate America than I do in my nonprofit boards, but it's creeping in much more, is being very strategic about the composition of your board. So that you say, what are the skill sets that I need? If I'm the CEO, what does the CEO need as skill sets, right? Help around the board. And then to make sure that you have that set of skill sets in your trustees or directors or board members around you. And that actually can be extremely helpful, because if you have a marketing issue, it's great to go to the marketing person. If you have a financial expert or 2 or 3, that's very helpful when you're in an unusual crisis. So I think strategically around, yes, the board owns the selection of the management. It also should be very important in the setting of the strategy, but then getting the right people to help that happen. That's enough for me at the moment.
Thank you, Phoebe. Tanya.
Good. You know, it's well said. I would add on to what Phoebe said in terms of the board composition. I think that's, Elizabeth and I talked about a little bit on the drive over here. That's really emerging as a difference. In the past, I think boards were comprised largely of CEOs, and somebody had the CEO was the expert considered to be expert across many disciplines. And now there's much more focus on very strategic, this skill set, whether it's marketing or finance or supply chain or whatever it is. And I think the company, during that strategy setting process, when they're laying out all of their strategic initiatives, the board should be asking, you know, what skills are we missing? The management has probably already assessed that, right? They should be as they've gone down that path. But between management and the board, they can look and say, what else can we get help with? What areas do we need help with? And how does that play into the board's the skills assessment matrix? And it may not be a new board member this year. It may be something that we go through the planning process, because it takes a while to go through a board search. But as you fill that pipeline up, what skill set do we need? The other thing I would say is I'm fairly new to a board. One thing that beyond, I agree with setting the strategy is hugely important. And as a part of that, we talked about ESG and risk, and that's a part of setting the strategy. You have to take all of that into account. It's not separate, that you don't do your strategy and then do ESG and then do risk. But one of the things I'd recommend for especially new board members is to do your homework between board sessions. So your boards meet periodically, and during COVID, it was a lot more frequently. But if you're new to an industry, which could be one of the reasons that you're brought into the board, because you have a completely different perspective, make sure you're reading in between those board meetings about what's going on in that industry in total, not just for your company. Sign up for alerts, all those types of things, so that you can stay current and can for the most part, be help to management. Not that they aren't on top of things, but that when you come to those board meetings, you're not always receiving information. You're also giving information from what you may have learned outside, just reading. So in between, don't look at it as the board meeting is in a month or two, and then in between that time, be reading and trying to understand as much as you can about the industry and your company also.
I think that Tanya's answered a question that we have gotten from the audience, so I just want to pause for a second, because the question is, how do you see diversity in board members playing a role in board oversight? And so Tanya spoke about diversity of skill set, and that the going out after targeted skill set has naturally evolved what the boardroom looks like for many companies. So Neil and Phoebe, do you have anything to add to this concept of diversity and oversight?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think it's great that an old white male can be the diversity feature on a panel like this.
We love it.
I think diversity I think it's gotten a bad name because it's been labeled as a filling up slots versus what Tanya said, which is filling up need. So I don't know that I'm the only guy that grew up in a rural area. That's a valuable level of diversity that I think is relevant. It's a different perspective. And I think that when you can get competence in multiple dimensions, and it's not along male, female, black, white, it's along what are your life experiences that can make the entity that you're involved with better. So I think diversity I think it's been embraced in a bad way as more of a check the box instead of a, fill the roster for a broader view of the world.
I think diversity of thought and diversity of backgrounds is absolutely critical for better decision-making. It's sort of proven that that's there. And if I were thinking as the CEO of a company, I would want to make sure that I had a great think tank of many different capabilities available to me. If I am the chairman of a board, I'm going to want to make sure that I understand and hear the voices of all of the different stakeholders, shareholders, et cetera, that are there. Boards are thinking very strategically about this. They're thinking, do I have not only gender diversity, racial diversity, do I have age diversity, do I have background diversity, et cetera. So there's a lot of thinking going on in diversity. But I will share this with you, that in publicly traded corporate America, if you do not have a sufficiently diverse board, the institutional investors are now voting against the chairman of the Nom Gov committee because they don't have representation either by women or racial minorities on the board. And so that's showing up in the votes very significantly. And so those of you who are associated or watching publicly traded companies, you can actually see this occurring. And so the companies that advise institutional investors on how to vote in their proxy, the so-called proxy advisors, are really taking a hard look at the diversity of many different types on the board and are requesting that each director self-disclose what it is that about them that they would want to disclose. So it's quite powerful because they're using it as withholding votes for directors. And when that happens, you get a lot of attention. So just if you're not aware of that, that's something to be very much aware of. I know that I chair a Nom Gov committee and my votes were far less this year. And they said it's simply because you don't have the right diversity on your board. And they're very clear about it. And the person they take it out on is the chairman of the Nom Gov committee, who they believe has the power to get that to be fixed. And so just watch that, because it's a very clear trend. How far it goes and how far it penetrates down into smaller companies, it's not going to be that powerful, but it's clearly a trend. But the other thing that I'd be cautious about, and Neil said it so well, there are a little bit of trends. We need someone with cyber experience, or we need someone with, maybe you just see trends that come and go. We need to have our own person on the board who is, representing this particular group. I think we need to be careful about trends and be ever strategic about what it is that you seek and need on your board, and then go to find it. I just share, it's a little uncomfortable to talk about it, but sometimes we don't know each other well enough. If you asked me to identify certain racial groups, I would, how many of them do I know? So if you're going to ask me for a recommendation, I'm going to have to work hard to increase my knowledge base, and that's why I think we are where we are today. So I just encourage you to broaden your base of what I call the think tank that's available to us out there in all ways, and be strategic about it.
So Phoebe, when you say that you're held accountable, I assume that they're looking at what the board looks like, not looking deeper at what the skill set is. So in other words, how many men, women, or am I wrong? Are they looking at the skill set?
So right now, they're just looking at gender diversity and racial, ethnic diversity, because it's easy. It's easy to do that. It's harder to say, is this person really a cyber expert? Is this really person an ESG expert? Is this person? It's just harder.
Right.
It's a harder.
Well, the
standard.
context in which Tanya and I were talking about it this morning is the search for a specific skill set will naturally lead you outside of your own group, as you said, and it will lead you into groups of other people that might bring other diversity besides just skills, hopefully.
Yeah,
So-
this is an emerging area that is absolutely fascinating to watch. And I just share with you one thing. I was on an informal board meeting. We've been meeting for a couple of years, call it a kitchen cabinet, 3 white males and me on it. And at the end of one meeting, we had been talking about, doesn't matter the topic. And I got an email much later that night from one of them, and he said, I am thanking God for bringing you, because the perspectives that you have are so different from what I ever would have thought about or ever would have known. And he said, we're just making so much better decisions. That's completely unsolicited. That's not why I'm associated with this at all. But it's just interesting that there are perspectives that we just don't have. Sometimes we live in different cultures. And for us to be able to say, here's what I'm focused on in this nonprofit, in this academic institution, in this corporate, let's keep focused on that, and we can all make really such tremendous contributions.
Thank you. Okay, I'd like to pivot and try to give our audience maybe some specific tools here. Neil mentioned onboarding and how important it is for a board. The question from the audience is, how involved should management be in onboarding? But I guess I'd like to make that even broader, and if you can think of any best practices that you've seen with onboarding. As you were talking, Neil, I thought you mentioned that a board member should be invested in, and so like on a not-for-profit board, certainly it should be an expectation that a monetary donation and or a donation of time is made, and that can all be handled in the interview stage. What other best practices have you seen or would you suggest for onboarding?
So one of the things I've seen, I actually implemented this in a board I sit on. We actually define that a new board member will be given 2 mentors. And those mentors are responsible for not just describing the process and what's going on, they actually have to introduce him to at least 4 of management. So we have sit-downs with the new board member, and might be the CFO, certainly the CEO, somebody usually in a plant or in operations. So that's the biggie, is just give them a broader perspective of the people that they're going to be working with and what the process is.
Tanya, do you have any?
Yeah, similarly from I'll just add like a mentor responsibility there. One of the things that was helpful for me in the first few board meetings that I was on, I had a mentor, but after the session, because we were traveling back together, there was a feedback session, real time on questions that I asked or questions that I had after the meeting and those types of things. But it's really on getting me more comfortable in the whole process and what's going on, and her giving me feedback on, well, this, you know, you did this really well, and I thought you really wanted to ask this question, and it just kind of helped with real-time straight talk of this went real well for you, and you got to do better over here. It was just like a performance evaluation real time. So it was helpful because it became very natural. And sometimes we would, you know, just, you know, we pick up the phone now and call each other and say, well, you know, I had some questions about this or that. So I think the mentor approach is very good because you're brand new, you're dropped into a group that's been working together. Not every day, but you'd be surprised how when you're in that room for 2 days at a time, it's like a year, right? So you form bonds, and then you're the new person, and you have these questions you kind of don't quite know what to fit in. So I think a mentor is a very good best practice. And I think the same thing with making the management available to new board members is really important. And depending on what type of board you're on, if it's a manufacturing type board, being able to go visit a site, seeing what people do, that's sometimes that's a lot of work for management sometimes, but it's very helpful for you to really get in and, you know, see what you've got the strategy set, but it's a good thing to understand what happens. And I think the employees really appreciate that you've taken some time to spend with them. So I think the whole onboarding is really trying to figure out how to give you the right amount of information about the company to have those meetings be meaningful to you and so that you can contribute. But it's also making sure you have the mentor and you have those small group sessions so you can become a part of a new body that is already formed, and you're trying to get in there and be a part of that.
It's a combination of giving that new board member some confidence and then arming him with some knowledge,
Yep.
right? There's plenty of people that have too much confidence. There's plenty of people that don't have enough knowledge.
Right.
But you need both.
I think onboard, I'll just pile in here, I think Tanya said it so well. Onboarding is so critical. It's a management responsibility, and then board mentorship. I just might add one of the things of a best practice that I've observed that has come into boards more recently, and that is annual survey of, you know, how are we doing as a board. And so some people do that by hiring a firm to ask those questions so that it can be anonymous and independent. Sometimes it's done by the chair of the board, sometimes it's done by the chair of the NomGov committee. There are all many different ways of doing that. I have found it to be extremely, extremely effective. And so one board, we do it on an annual basis. The chair of the board and I, as the chair of NomGov, talk to every single director. This is a publicly traded board. And we ask a series of questions and sometimes we wander way far from the formal questions. Sometimes they want to make comments on strategy. Sometimes they would want to make comments on what they want to do in terms of board development. You know, I would like to chair a committee, or I'd like to, you know, work on a different committee, et cetera. Extremely helpful. And so then we've just put those together, and the answers anonymously, but presented to the board and said, here's what you collectively said about each other and the kinds of things that we can do better. I would encourage any board to have an annual process of just looking at itself. What went well? What did we do well? What did we not do well? And that's just a healthy process. It doesn't have to be long. Doesn't have to be expensive. Just ask the question.
Yeah, we do a similar thing, and it's part of the calendar, probably same thing with
Okay.
you. So like at a particular meeting, first quarter, second quarter, whatever it is,
Right.
that it's on the calendar. And it is very helpful because you do get the evaluation and the feedback. And what's interesting is that it also helps with the skills matrix, because people start to tell, like you were maybe brought on the board for a particular skill set, but because of your participation, they say, oh, you actually know a little bit about this. And so it could eliminate the need to go out and get that special
Right.
trend thing,
That's
right?
right.
Because you've got that knowledge. So that is that is a good best practice.
And onboarding will need to be customized, because the people that you bring onto your board, if you're bringing on someone who is in that industry but retired, they already know it. They don't need to have all the experience, all of the site experiences. If you're coming into a new industry and you don't know that industry, you are having to know. Let's go and see what's the manufacturing sites look like, in depth with the CFO, et cetera, just to really understand what's going on. I also encourage new directors to read broadly about the industry. And I think it's incumbent on the chairman of the board or the chair of NomGov to say, here's what I read every day about this industry. Here are the kinds of things that you may want to read about it. Because as Tanya mentioned earlier, you need to do something with this all the time. I often say it this way, what is the director for? You're there to help on the critical decisions I've already made, but you're also really important in a crisis. And if you're not up to speed every day with what is happening, you aren't ready to help them in a crisis. And so if you're out of touch and you haven't kept whatever the critical issues are, whether it's not necessarily, I'm not going to talk about sales, but competitive things, inflation, Fed policy, if you're not current on all that, you can't really help them as much. So I would just strongly encourage a daily dose of reading on each industry in which you're involved. I just think it's healthy.
Okay. So now we want our audience to be able to learn from your own experience. So can you give an example of a great learning event? Tanya, we'll start with you from serving on boards.
From serving on boards,
Yes,
okay.
from that
that's
perspective,
good.
if you can.
Great. I thought it was going to be from management perspective because I run supply chain, so it's pretty ugly right now.
Sorry.
We're feeling your pain.
Yeah, but it's related. I'd say, kind of new to boards. I've been on board for the last 4 years, but I think we've gone through a CEO transition, which Phoebe talked about, which was a very good one. So it's not I'd say, something, for me, it was a matter of going through the diligence of that process of working. It was a very transparent process. We identified people that were clear contenders and put them through all kinds of management development programs and had our very open board meetings where they were involved so that they could understand everything that was going on with all the committee meetings and those types of things, and then looked at external as well. So it ended up being a very, we ended up going with an internal candidate, and it was a very nice, transition through that, and he's doing a great job right now. So that was, as I think as Phoebe mentioned, one of the main criteria for the board is to get that right and to make sure that you're constantly looking at your succession, process. Where we are now, some of the emerging things we'll talk about a little bit later is looking at DE&I and ESG and trying to figure all of that out from what's important to the company and what they'll be doing. And just in terms of real crisis, I'm sure everybody's heard enough of this, so I won't spend any time on it, but during COVID, that proved we spent a lot of time with management working through decisions, and the Zoom calls worked really well. And so what we learned from that is, in addition to working through the crisis, but as a board, was how do we stay in touch more frequently? Because before everything was in person, and it was lots of space in between, so we could have more checks. And we've actually modified our entire board format to intentionally have 2 virtual meetings a year and two in person, because we thought we were pretty effective. But so those are some of the good things that came out of COVID. Obviously, there's a lot still going on with COVID. So that's I'd say that's some of the things that we've been working through.
Thank you. Neil?
I joined a public board. This was back in 1991. It was a biotech company in Boston. And I was the newest member, and I was the 8th board member. And all 7 board members were good friends with the CEO. And I go into a compensation meeting. This is my very first meeting. And the CEO puts forth, he was also the chairman of the board, he puts forth a very lucrative option plan for himself. And it didn't make any sense to me. And I said, that just doesn't seem fair for the performance and what your role is. And all the other board members were like, no, that's literally all 7. We're like, this is a great plan. And they said, didn't you read your board minutes on the options that you're also going to be granted? And, that was agreed upon before the board meeting with the friends. And I did not make friends. And I ended up selling out that stock about 4 quarters later, made good money. But I could be a voice, but I couldn't turn, the boys club. So, and that's the reason I say speak up, because you will get in situations where it is a bad situation. I mean, it is a situation where it's so ingrained in culture that maybe the best things aren't happening. So That's the reason earlier I said speak up. So that one did not go that well for me because they didn't like me a lot.
Thank you for
Yes,
sharing.
so I would offer this, some of the best stories I can't tell you because it's inappropriate for me to tell you the stories of what happens in the corporate boardroom because we all work hard to have prepared and to have our views and to share them, but when we walk out, we're united. So I just share openly, though, that the challenges are come when you really differ as directors over strategy. What should we do? What should we not do? And if you're making a big bet, if it's a bet the company kind of decision, you want to spend a fair amount of time on it because it's very hard to undo that decision. And so that can be quite heated. I'm on one board now where there are activists. That's brand new for me. And how that operates and how you change when you have activists. I can't imagine what it's like on the ExxonMobil board with, the number of new activists they have with very specific ideas about what they might do with regard to that company. I think that behavior in a boardroom you can fix over time. So if you have someone who is either domineering or someone who comes unprepared, you can get that fixed. Might take a little energy, might take a little doing, might take a little time, but you can fix that. But the legitimate discussions about strategy and where to go, those are real and worth spending time on. And if you had 7 people who were just in your corner, I'm not sure you're getting the best advice necessarily. Yeah, exactly. So I think that you want to have people who can do the work, come prepared, give you those kinds of perspectives. Frankly, though, if I look back in the most challenging times as a director, and I've been a director on a public board continuously since 2002 and on nonprofits for a very long time, 4 academic university boards, many nonprofits. Nothing prepared us for COVID. Nothing. And so we went from maybe 4 or 5 board meetings a year to board meetings sometimes every week, sometimes every other week, every company. And so if you want to test yourself and you want to test a board and test a management team, just have a pandemic. And you'll find out. And I think what I would just comment, those of you, you're all running companies, you know who rose up to the challenges and those who didn't. And it was just such a tremendous opportunity for leadership and to show what different people can do when you're in a crisis. And that is you don't get many chances in life to see that kind of a crisis where people can really rise up to the occasion. So I would just say, look hard for that. And we also found that in the boardroom. There were people who rose up and just performed in the boardroom in a way that we wouldn't have expected. And some part of it was that we adopted this Zoom protocol of everybody talking, as opposed to just hearing from the articulate vocal ones, but to hear from those who are generally pretty quiet. So anyway, I just trying to give you a few practical ideas.
So Bill and Jim will not invite me back if I don't shift to ESG and cover a little bit of it before we're done. So Tanya, can you talk about what metrics your company tracks, ESG metrics?
Yeah, sure. So we talked about a little bit before the other presentation about some of the key metrics. And I think the important thing about metrics is there's no shortage of metrics in ESG. It's to make sure that you spend the time, management spends the time, the board spends the time with management on what key metrics will drive the business. Because you can measure just about anything, but does it matter from your business? So the key thing before you establish the metrics for what we do is understand what are the key points to the strategy, and then is that driven by, and where does that come from a stakeholder perspective? Is it customer driven, operational driven? Is it key to moving our revenue forward? Those types of things, and then align the strategy to that. So from an ESG perspective, there's obviously on the S, there's going to be all kinds of diversity related metrics that are very, they're not hard to get. And anybody who says they are, that's just not true. The question is, how do you present it to say, these are what the numbers are, and what are we doing about it? So it's the decision of what you report. Reporting it is not very difficult. The data is there. It's in everybody's, PeopleSoft or Workday, whatever it is. Environmental metrics, much more difficult because you have to spend the time to figure out what's important to you and then establish your baseline. And because environmental metrics are a reduction, I'm going to reduce, I'm here and I'm going to reduce. So you have to spend the time to pick the right metric and then say, how is this going to impact my business and how are we going to reduce it? So those are, for the board that I'm on, we're looking at a lot of diversity, DE&I, diversity, equity, inclusion type metrics, and then the normal emissions, water, waste metrics that you would have kind of from an operational perspective. But again, I think what you measure is not as important as spending the time to see how does it drive your business forward, and because that's when you're going to get, it's not going to be a check the box at that point, it's actually going to be a part of your business, and it's just going to be something that you do to move the business forward, and I'm measuring it. Sorry for that long answer.
Are you comfortable commenting on if management is held accountable for these things that are being measured?
So that's a good question in terms that we're emerging there, and that's one of the discussions that we're having. And we have, I think I was asking the gentleman here about ESG committees even, because we were looking at because that resides in the compensation committee and how executive CEOs and the rest of the executive team is measured. And so we're just starting to study that right now. We don't have an opinion. I'd be interested to see where the people are landing on that. But because it's so, we've got to make sure that we know, again, what it's tied to, why we're doing it, and then what's the right measurement. But it's we're discussing it now because that seems to be where where this is going, but we're not there right now.
Okay, thank you. Neil?
I might get stoned for my next comment. I really believe the Pharisees and the scribes would have loved ESG. I think a company is foolish to ignore ESG. Obviously, I think it's been around for a very long time. There's good practices that fall within ESG. I think it's being named now, and I think for bad companies being held accountable, the social issues are real, and it's not just diversity. The governance issues, I think it's a little dangerous to talk about stakeholders. I think it's fine to talk about shareholders and other affected entities, but I still think governance is about shareholders. And I think the stakeholder comment is giving a lot of voices at the table that may not be relevant. And to Tanya's point, what you measure matters. It's not just, what drives your business. It is what drives society also. I mean, you should not use more water than you need to. You should not pollute our waters. Environmental issues do matter. Long term, I believe that companies are held accountable for relevant ESG issues. In other words, if you don't have sustainability, and I mean sustainability in all forms, that's sustainability. If you don't treat your employees with respect, that's non-sustainable. If you don't have good customer service, that's not sustainable. So I am, a couple of guys in my office said, do not speak on ESG. You will only step on yourself. You will screw it up. And I will, because I think that, the metrics are endless, and anyone else can choose your metrics, and they can hold you accountable to what may be irrelevant for your business, but you can be hung in the public square for it. So I don't like what ESG is doing in terms of making it random law, social law, because I don't think it makes companies better, and I don't think it makes companies better employers necessarily. And at the end of the day, you want better products, you want better employers, and you want more profitable companies, and you want to protect the environment in every way you can. You want to respect mankind. I mean, that's a rule of law that should exist in all the ways that we live. And I think ESG is trying to get at that. I'm not convinced that it's being harnessed in the right way for the good of mankind.
Okay, thank you. Phoebe?
Just to give a little different perspective on it from the financial side. I think many of you listening are CFOs, and this is what has been interesting to me is that we tried the political world, Paris Accord, whatever, to have a sort of a political solution to, say, climate change. And it really was, many people elected out of it, didn't take action against it. But something happened along the way when the money managers started deciding and started taking a decision. They're getting pressure from the people they're asked to manage their money. Please do it please invest it in a socially responsible, or please invest it in high ESG companies. So what has occurred is a tremendous change, in my opinion, again, speaking as a financial person, in the amount of money that is being earmarked and specifically directed toward those companies that fit the investor's interest. And so if you go to the Morgan Stanley MSCI indices and take a look at them, you can invest in all kinds of different, whether it's faith-based or green investing or high ESG. You can pick it. I was literally just checking it out this morning, all the different ways in which you can invest. So what is, I think, quite profoundly changing is that investors, whether you're a sovereign wealth fund or whether you're a pension plan or whether you're an academic endowment, they're beginning to ask the questions, where are you investing my money? And what kind of, ESG rating or what kind of greenness or what kind of sustainability does this have? I know I sit on the board of the Gaines Foundation, and we have a small endowment on a relative basis, but we do give away money every year and we invest that. And so we just asked our advisor to run it through the MSCI ESG index just to see. We just want to know. We just want to know, how is it, given what funds that we're in and where the investment profile is, how do we rank? What's happening is that family offices, academic endowments, and now pension funds are really moving in this direction. So I would encourage all of you to just watch that space. I completely agree with Neil on, we don't have any common metrics. That's the problem. Nobody knows how to measure something. If you take water is different if you're Coca-Cola, if you're a nuclear power plant, if you're Brown-Forman, or you're the water company. I mean, they're just, what's a responsible way to manage water is going to be different for each one of those. So if you're a CFO, you're going to be watching SASB and what the Sustainability Accounting Standard Board is going to be doing. I think this is a whole area that is being developed right now. And so I think it's going to factor in more and more because investors are demanding it, and those money managers are offering it in ways that we've just never really had before. So I encourage you to take a look at that.
Did you mention, Phoebe, whether you use a third party to provide assurance on ESG metrics?
Yeah, so this is a huge another emerging area. Here I am at a Dean Dorton event. If it emerges in a particular direction that I think might happen, you're going to get SASB, Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, who will be able to do some kind of an attestation as to whether or not the metrics that you're showing. And so I think it's not there. We are not there. Europe is way ahead, so there's certain things. I know TCFD, Task Force on Climate Change, but that's carbon and climate change in particular. The things here, Sustainalytics, MSCI, carbon credits, all of those, that's just emerging area. So I would, if you're not affected by it already, you might be. And so and if you've got money that you're managing, whether it's your pension fund or endowment or whatever, just think about what you might want to do with that. And so I don't know where that's going to end because it's evolving. You can have an influence on it by your actions.
So we trade futures. So we develop quantitative trading models. That's what my main thing I do for a living. And we had two ESG experts come in to discuss what our different exposures looked like and what it meant. And I said, if being long crude oil futures is bad, is being short crude oil futures good? I said, you could probably argue that. I said, what if I buy crude oil because the Colonial Pipeline is going away, and I think that's good for the environment, so crude oil is going up? They said, well, you could argue that's a positive ESG move because you're ESG aware. And and again, I think it depends. I think when you're dealing as a corporate level in the way you operate in the space of society, I think it's, there are metrics that you could probably create. But when you start getting into investments, and what if I'm a short-term quant manager and I buy Exxon or I short Exxon and it's purely price-based algorithms, am I a bad ESG person for buying Exxon when the computer is the one that told me to do it? And at the end of the day, they literally went in circles on themselves and they said, you just shouldn't trade crude oil. So it's a difficult space.
It's extremely difficult, but the pressure is there, and the asset managers are putting forward very specific ETFs and mutual funds for you to do. I just watch this space because they are trying to figure out what is the way for responsible investing. And so it's a long way from apartheid in South Africa.
I think responsible investing is making more money on your money.
And many people believe that, and many others have a broader view.
I had one comment about ESG, back to ESG, and it's not about the financial investing, which I'm sure will continue to emerge, but for those of you who are on boards of international companies, particularly companies that do business in Europe, and it's not about being told what to do, it's again being proactive. So I think the metrics are, to Neil's point, it's not about, being told you must do this and this, but you need to get ahead, especially in Europe. US is very close behind, but Europe is there in terms of saying, if it's Coca-Cola, whatever it is, this is what's important to me. This is how I can reduce my environmental impact. Nobody's telling you what to do there. This is the opportunity for ESG, as cloudy as it is, to define your strategy. And you're going to be held, you won't be accused of greenwashing if you're not just measuring everything. You're saying, this is what matters to me. So it's the time to be strategic about what you care about ESG, whether people, whether it ends up being good from the financials, from the trading side, don't know. But if you're running a business, especially if you're running an international business, it's hugely important that you understand where everybody is around the world on ESG and that you're proactive in deciding what you care about and get busy measuring that and tracking to that. Because especially on the environmental side, green is green. I mean, it saves money. And there's no business case for it. We can talk about it all we want to, but when you make decisions to be sustainable and to reduce resources and all those kinds of things, it just works.
It does.
And so that's you got to kind of get away from I'm being told to do something versus this makes sense and how can I go win for my business.
Well, United Technologies in their annual report, 20 years ago, would lay out exactly how much water they use, the reduction in water, what they were doing with their Freon. So, it's not like it's not good management to save resources and to be more sustainable. I think it's good economics.
Amen.
Tanya, are you comfortable talking about your experience with diversity now?
What's now mean?
Now? Okay.
Like right now? What does that mean? I don't.
We had a question, so.
With diversity now. Comfortable talking about my experience with diversity.
Okay. Just diversity.
Just
okay,
diversity.
Wrong question. Okay.
Okay. I thought there was an initiative or something. Diversity now.
I thought it was an organization.
All right. That's what I didn't understand. Okay. My experience with diversity. Sure. So we've kind of talked about it from board diversity, and I think I don't remember. I think it was maybe Phoebe was talking about some of the non-gov pressures there, and so I'm going to blend my management, my personal management with the governance piece of it. While it is important, there's a push right now from NASDAQ and everybody else to really focus on diversity, and that's important. But as a board member, you should think of that. that is important to think about it that way, but from your employee base, your talent, and that's really what drives your organization. They're looking at board diversity for very different reasons. It's not about reporting to, it's not about the governance and report, the check the box kind of thing. It's about looking at a board that represents them. And that means race, gender, it also means backgrounds and those types of things. So when you're putting the board when you're thinking about board diversity and you're looking at it from the lens of these are the trends, that's true. But you also need to look at it as your board should reflect your company. And there's some measurements and all of that as well, but it's less about the measurements with me as it is about you have a talent force that you're trying to develop, and you want them to believe there's a place for them, no matter who they are, and similarly make sure their voices are heard. All of that is a part of it. So we talk about it's interesting, I think in some businesses, the boards have really taken to heart that we must be diverse, and in some cases, the board is more diverse now than the company. So, you can't just stop. You can't just go chase whatever is out there that's the latest metric to say, oh, got that, we got board diversity, and then there's no diversity in your company. And vice versa, if you got good diversity in your company, then you've got to match that up with the board diversity. So I think from my perspective, it's just like ESG, there's all kinds of measurements and those kinds of things, but do what really makes sense. And, we talk about stop counting people and making people count, because that's what's really important from a diversity perspective for me.
Okay, thank you. We only have 5 minutes left, so we would like to leave our audience with some tips, best practices on how to start to find opportunities to serve on a board. And so that could be a not-for-profit, could be a small company board, bank board, or a public company. So for example, I know with respect to not-for-profits or governmental boards, in Lexington, the Fayette County government hosts, I don't know what it's called, but like committee fairs, and you can go to this one location and walk around to different booths and learn all the different volunteer opportunities that the city of Lexington has for appointed board members. So do you have any kind of best practices at any level?
I'll make a comment. I've got a good friend who sold his business. He's about my age, and he doesn't know why his phone isn't ringing and people aren't asking him to serve on not-for-profit boards, private boards, public boards, whatever. And he's not involved in anything. And I said, it's a little bit like saying, I want to be the CEO as a start. I mean, a board member typically comes out of an involvement where you're volunteering or you're giving your time or your money to something. And you're unlikely to get on a board if you're not giving of yourself in some way before you join the board.
That's good.
So well said. So well said. I think that, prepare yourself to be an excellent board member, and there are many things you can do. Number one, get involved at the ground level on something. Get yourself familiar with whether it's that industry, get yourself familiar with the other people, and be something that board needs, whether it's your cyber expert or a financial expert or a marketing or what maybe you speak Mandarin and you're a government contractor, have expertise. That's going to be valuable to someone. So I usually say to people, make sure that you know what you are really good at, and let people know, I've got skills in such and such, and I'd like to be able to share them with some boards. And just to let people know that. If you are looking for corporate boards, that's a whole different kind of specific that I could talk to people individually about. If you're looking for an academic board, start giving money to the institution, start getting involved, et cetera, et cetera. If you're looking for a nonprofit, it's much the same way. If you're looking for a government agency, it's get to know the process of applying and the political appointees. So what is that? Being strategic about getting yourself ready and putting yourself in a position to be ready, noticed, and willing to serve.
Thank you. Tanya, do you have any? Quite a list.
Quite a list there. I would just say the only nonprofit thing that I learned over the years, I think nonprofit boards are really a good feeding ground if you're interested in serving, and as both of these folks have said, you should be involved in the organization, and then it kind of naturally flows. The more you're involved, the more they want you to be involved. But you should take advantage of the committee structure on nonprofit boards because you could get involved in finance committee if you want to really, get better from a finance perspective. So if you're on a nonprofit board, don't just be on the board, choose a committee where you can actually learn something and add some value to that then you can take forward. As you said, it's a different situation for a corporate board, but you can start to learn, the vernacular and those types of things that go on in a finance committee or in a governance committee, and they could help you as you move forward.
Okay, thank you all. We are at the end of our hour, so I apologize to those of you that submitted questions that we did not get to. But again, Bill and Jim won't ask me back if I don't end promptly when I'm supposed to. So thank you. We thank you to our panelists, and we now have a 10-minute break.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Nice to see you again, Phoebe. You're trying to turn it on.
All right, good morning, everyone. We're going to get started for the last session of the morning. Thanks again for being here with us today. Today, we're going to talk to you about the current trends and best strategies for data breach response and litigation. My name is Guy Cozy. I'm the cybersecurity practice lead for Dean Dorton. I've been working in cybersecurity for more than 20 years, and I've got some experience from the corporate side, but also on the consulting side. I'm really happy to be here with you today. With me, I've got Colin Jennings from Square Pattern Box. If you want to introduce yourself.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming. So I'm a partner in our law firm, which is a global law firm. We've got about 1,500 lawyers around the world. And I was telling these guys last night when we met that the way I got into data breach response was I was in my car, I got a phone call, and there were 95 people on the line saying, we've had a data breach, what do we do? And so from there, we've sort of had to deal with this issue constantly. And so we've worked very heavily with Guy and his team, and it's been a really great partnership. So when they asked if I would come down and do this, I said absolutely. So hopefully this will be helpful to all of you, and please ask questions. This is a complicated area. We're going to try to move relatively quickly, but ask questions. Let us know if there's things we're not covering you think you'd like to talk about. Please let us know, because we want to make this as useful as we can for everyone.
Absolutely. Thank you, Colin. And also, thank you for being with us today. Colin drove all the way from Cleveland to be with us today, and to share his wisdom with our attendees. So thank you. So this morning, we have 4 main objectives. We're going to talk about the current and future trends from a cyber perspective, but also from a legal perspective. We're going to talk about what organizations can do to prep for a security data event, and we're going to talk about that incident response process, and of course, gain a better understanding of litigation. So first, we'll talk about the trends we see in the industries from a cyber perspective. We'll go through some statistics, and then we'll talk about regulator expectations as well. So the first set of statistics comes from a document called the Verizon Data Breach Incident Report. It is something that Verizon publishes every year. It's about 15 years. And it's a very useful document. You can download it for free on their website. They collect and gather information from thousands and thousands of data security incidents, and they do some analysis, and they also do that by industries. So it's very useful as you're looking at the specific threats that your organization may have to deal with. What are they, and what are your peers doing? So here, what's important to note is three kinds of attacks are very prevalent, what we call credential theft, errors, and social media. So we'll come back on what that is, and our presentation is really going to focus on what do we do, understanding the impact of these specific threats to your environment. Of course, ransomware is on the rise. Every day it seems like we hear about a new data incident, data breach involving ransomware. And then interesting statistics here, more and more web application breaches that we see in the field. This is where the data resides. So if we think about the end goal from a cyber criminal perspective, it's to get to your data, access sensitive data. And so a lot of that data resides in databases that have a web application front end. It's also important to note that there's a trend for organizations to migrate to cloud environments, thinking about Office 365 or the G Suite for emails and other SaaS models. So these kind of data events kind of are part of that web application statistic right here.
So one of the things that's really a focus is, what are these threat actors looking for in your environment? 58% of the time they're looking for personal identifying information. Now, that what is personal information actually changes based upon what state of residence those individuals are located. And if you have global operations, the European Union and the UK define privacy much stronger and much more harshly than we do here in the United States. Even your business card is considered personal identifying information in the European. You can't say EU anymore because you got to include the UK, so it gets complicated. But so whenever you're dealing with Europe, you have to be very careful about personal identifying information and whether you're moving in the US, and there's lots of privacy concerns. But the focus for threat actors is ultimately they can monetize that personal data, they can sell it, they can do identity theft, they can do all sorts of other things. You need to be very careful about where is that sensitive information. The other information they're looking for is your financial information so that they can try to misdirect payments or raid bank account information. And then your intellectual property. That's another area where we've seen very targeted attacks where they come into your environment, actually seek out specific technology to steal it. But most of the time, particularly for ransomware attacks, it's going to be focused on your personal identifying information. The other piece that's really troubling is there are a lot of errors, and these threat actors like to take advantage of errors. So for example, we had a client who inadvertently left a port open on a internet-facing machine, and ultimately threat actors were able to download the personal identifying information of over 3 million people, and ultimately sold it on the dark web, and the client didn't know about it for another 8 months until one of the individuals identified that it looked like their data set was made available on the dark web. And it creates lots of issues in terms of customer relationships, dealing with regulators, things like that. So trying to really understand where your data is and how to protect it, so that if someone does get into your system, how do you make sure that ultimately those individuals aren't able to either encrypt or exfiltrate or access that data, which triggers lots of legal obligations, which we'll talk about later. So what are the current trends we're seeing? Sophistication. These groups are really motivated. They take advantage of any opportunity. And once they get into your system, they move very quickly. They have dedicated scripts that seek out the data they're looking for, PII, your financial information, or your IP. The ransom environment is incredible. So the market used to be a few years ago that a very high ransom was $500,000, $1 million. Now we're seeing ransom amounts $20, $30, $50 million. And they're not negotiating down as much because given the sophistication of the attack, they're coming in, they're exfiltrating the data before they execute the ransomware amount, or before they execute the ransomware script. And ultimately what they're doing is they're taking the data, they're selling it, or they're posting it on a shame site to add additional leverage, saying that we're going to post your sensitive IP, your customer information, or the PII that you have in your environment, and make that available. Then they're encrypting your network and making you basically pay a ransom amount to decrypt your own information and get access to it. And there's these gangs that work in combination. So there's one group that does the credential harvesting, the next that does reconnaissance on your system, the third deploys the ransomware, and the fourth one negotiates with you. And they ultimately split the proceeds of the attack. It's a way for them to diversify, and that's one of the reasons that the costs are going up. So these are professional criminal groups that are actually organized to steal your data and basically wreak havoc on your system. So prevention, as we're going to talk about a lot today, is really important. One thing that they do in addition to exfiltrating data is they will come in their reconnaissance phase, identify where backups are, and basically destroy them, so that once they've encrypted your network, the only set of data that you have that you can get your business back up and running is encrypted and under control of them, so you have to pay the ransom amount. There's a very large insurance company, global insurance company, that just paid $40 million, publicly disclosed, to get their data back because the threat actors were able to come in, destroy the backups. There was only one set of information and they needed to restore it, and that's why they had to pay it. So the attackers really created that leverage. The other piece, and Guy mentioned this, moving to the cloud creates all sorts of new risk because you've got third-party suppliers, vendors, everyone working through the cloud. That just introduces new risk and new avenues for penetration to your data. And then regulator expectations have gone through the roof because of the focus on the Colonial Pipeline attack and other attacks like that. Regulators have stepped up their expectations for companies, and so whenever we're on a call with regulators post-breach, the first question is, what happened, why didn't you prevent this? What you do in response to the attack, and then ultimately, how do you make sure this never happens again? And they get very granular in those discussions. And you need to be prepared to have those discussions so that so they understand that you took cybersecurity seriously, and you can explain what happened very precisely, because if they don't feel comfortable that the company is taking its cybersecurity and privacy obligations seriously, they'll open an investigation, and that may lead to attorney general or other actions, and also fines or other actions against the company.
And I'd like to emphasize 2 points that Colin mentioned. The speed of the attack is something that we see. We've seen situations where hundreds of servers were encrypted in just a matter of hours. So as you're thinking about, your processes, incident response, we'll talk about that. There's just a few hours to encrypt the entire network. Something else is a sophistication. Very recently, a playbook from a ransomware group called Conti, C-O-N-T-I, got leaked. And so you could actually download that playbook, and it shows, like step by step, how to hack an organization, what tools to use, how to harvest a credential on a workstation, how to elevate the privilege to a local administrator, to a domain administrator, how to find the sensitive information, how to zip that information very quickly, extract in multiple places, remove the logs, run the ransomware, and it's very, very methodical. That playbook really looks like an internal document that an organization would produce to do, documentation of IT processes, for instance. So it's very detailed. This way they can have turnover, it doesn't matter. They can recruit new people all the time. They are very hard to shut down.
So we've talked a little bit about the costs. These are just some statistics from the Verizon data breach report. You'll see that these are very large numbers, 7.13 million for a healthcare industry breach, which is up 10% from 2019. And 80% of breaches include PII. That's because the attackers are trying to take that data that they can monetize. But the most startling statistic in all this is that it costs about $150 per record to respond to the breach. So if you figure that the threat actors had access to 100 gigs or a terabyte or something like that, you can do the math, and it can get wildly expensive very quickly. And there's no real separation between small companies and big companies. The costs are pretty staggering, as you'll see here, $5.5 million for a large enterprise with 25,000 employees. But for an organization with under 500, it's still 2.6 million. So really the cost doesn't really scale with the size of the organization. The impact is really significant. So small organizations have actually an increased amount of risk facing ransomware. And one of the things is why cybersecurity really has to be a priority. And we'll talk about why, particularly in the litigation sense later. But the costs are just staggering in terms of downtime, business interruption, impact to your customer relationships, and then dealing with all the legal and commercial impact of it is really debilitating. We've had clients who've been down for upwards of 4 to 6 weeks, not able to produce anything on their lines because they weren't able to decrypt their data. So really kind of getting ahead of the issue and making sure that you're prepared to respond quickly allows you to restore and actually get yourself back moving forward, and puts you in a much better position with regulators as well as in response to litigation.
So what can you do to prep for these kind of events? Because unfortunately it's not a matter of if, but when for most organizations, is making sure that you understand your threat model. We'll go through an example of that, doing your risk assessment in the presentation. You've got your monitoring activities enabled. You can respond to security alerts. We've seen situations where there were alerts from the antivirus software that were just ignored by the IT team for 2 weeks. And so the bad guys were trying to get in, the antivirus was screaming, but yet nobody looked at the alerts, nobody reacted to these alerts, and that facilitated the network breach here. Making sure that you've got documents on your plans, your business continuities, you're doing tabletop exercise to prep. It's like if you're practicing a musical instrument or you're playing sport, you have to practice. And when you react to an event, you're going to bring people together that most of the time they're not just used to work together. You're bringing your C-suite, you're bringing your IT team, you're bringing third parties. Colin is going to walk you through that process. So it's very important to go through these exercises and making sure that your organization is ready to respond. What we often recommend is looking at different playbooks in terms of response. So for instance, if your environment is, you're concerned about ransomware, what would be the step-by-step response to a ransomware event? If you've had phishing incidents, what's your typical response? Looking at playbooks that kind of align with your threat model. So I'll talk about that a little bit later, but having these tabletop exercises on a regular basis that would be specific to your environment and your threat, I think is very important. I'll talk about the insurance, Colin.
So one thing that we always say to folks, particularly when the tabletop exercises are critical, because you don't want to be doing the response for the first time when you're in the middle of an event. It's too chaotic, there's too much disruption, trying to get yourself back up. So planning and preparation is key. The other piece is look at your insurance policy. You will likely be shocked at what it doesn't cover. And I always tell people, read insurance policies from the back forward. Don't read them from the front, because it'll sound like it's covering absolutely everything that you want it to. But once you get to the exclusions, that's when they take out social engineering or other things like that, that ultimately that's probably your highest risk from a direct financial loss. So misdirection of payments or things like that often are not covered. So if your CFO gets a fictitious email from the CEO that says send $500,000, that's typically social engineering. It would not be covered unless you have a specific rider. The other thing is look what's covered, but it's really important. So one of the things, takeaway here, is spend some time, look at your insurance policy and really understand what it covers and what it doesn't cover, and understand who you're going to talk to in the event of an issue, so that you can move very quickly and understand what obligations your carrier is going to have to you, so you don't get caught in a situation where you have to explain, oh, we thought we had cyber insurance, but it only covered the cost of stamps to mail out notifications. People didn't actually cover the business interruption or the remediation cost.
And that's probably one of the key takeaway from that presentation, is to do that homework. We help clients getting ready, and we review their cyber insurance policies. And just give you a quick example, a client had a $4 million cyber security policies. There was a sublimit on ransomware at $200,000, and social was not covered. And when we looked at the statistic from Verizon, these are the two most prevalent types of attack, right? Ransomware and phishing, which is part of social. If your coverage doesn't include these two events, then you're in a lot of trouble, because that policy doesn't address your typical need. So very quick on the risk assessment, and that's, for me, a lot of organizations during the pandemic have shifted and send their workers home. A lot of organizations still operate in a hybrid environment where they've got some part of their workforce working from home. A lot of organizations at the time really tried to be easy on the employees, try to facilitate that transition, but didn't really look at their threat models. So when we're looking at preventing data security events, we need to look at this new model. Update your risk assessment to account for these threats that are specific to remote work. So for instance, how do you handle sensitive data? We've seen scenarios where employees tried to do the right thing, but didn't really know how to quickly share that information. Is using Dropbox okay? Can you send sensitive information via email? Can you use Google Drive? They try to do their job. They try to communicate. They try to share that data. But if there's no guidelines, if there's no policies in place, if they don't know how to do that, then they may try to create do the wrong shortcut and create an incident there. Bring your own device. Working from home, I think we're blurring the lines between what's a personal device, a computer that may be provided by the organization. Can you access your email from your personal phone? Do you have the right controls to do that? Is the computer the only computer at home? Are the kids going to do their homeworks on that computer? Do you have the right controls in place? It's also very easy to provide too much access. And the reason for that is when you're home and you want to install a software on your computer, well, some organizations are just granting, for instance, the ability to the employees to do so by granting local admin rights, right? So they don't call the support, or maybe there's not a good way for the IT support to help that person working from home. So that's too much access. And if they download a piece of malware, if they browse the wrong website, then their computer may become infected and spread to your corporate network if they connect back via VPN. So I'm not going to go through the detail here, but just wanted to provide a highlight of these are kind of new threats that you have to look for if you have a workforce that's still working from home. And again, a lot of organizations didn't take the time to step back and look at that and say, okay, are we truly protecting our information with this new paradigm, with this new world? Do we have the right controls in place? So we'll talk about some of the key controls that we think would help mitigating some of these data events. So the first point is access control. Multi-factor authentication is something that we talk all the time. You know, a combination of something that you know, like a password, a PIN, something that you have, like biometrics, using your face, your palm, your iris, something that you have, like a device or a token. If you looked at the statistics, a lot of credential theft occur because a password is stolen. I'm sure you're getting phishing emails all the time. They try to trick you to click on the link, and maybe you're directed to a site that looks like your organization's site, but it's not it. And so if you enter your credentials are stolen, and immediately the bad actors try to authenticate, get access to your information. So according to Microsoft, MFA really reduces credential theft by 98%. So that's really a key control on all remote access, which would include emails, right? We consider email as a form of remote access. Strong password policies. A lot of organizations have password complexity requirement enabled, but it's a false sense of security because employees have tons of different passwords. I mean, I'm sure you have hundreds of passwords between your personal account and your bank account and your home equipment and all kind of things. So what people tend to do is they reuse the same password and they use a formula when they have to change their password so they can remember their password. So if we were to do a penetration test today, we looked at the season. So we're close to fall. Let's say we're still in summer. We'll use something like summer 2021 ! And that's going to pass the Microsoft complexity requirement. But I can assure you that if we do that against your organization, we're going to find a handful of users that have that exact password, which is going to give us an entry point into the network. So the strong password policies is going beyond the MFAs, making sure that there are true complex passwords that are checked against weak passwords, passwords that are using formula, passwords that have been breached. The last point here is privileged account management, is making sure that you don't have too much access. So if you're an IT person, don't use your privileged account to surf the web, check your emails, make sure that your users don't have that local administrator password on their workstation. From a data breach perspective, data incident perspective, a lot is going on the endpoints. We often see a compromised workstation or laptops that then spread to the entire network. So make sure that you've got the right controls, that you're patching your devices, but you also have that next generation antivirus that's going to protect you from a lot of these threats that are not writing to disk anymore. Pretty much everything happens in memory. So your traditional antivirus software is not going to be able to catch the latest malware. Something else that's going to provide you is a lot of logs. And Colin will tell you that in some instances, we can't determine what happened because logs are not available. And when we're looking at a potential data incident, we want to make sure that we know who accessed the data, what happened to that data, what got touched by the threat actors, what got exfiltrated. That's going to change the risk profile of the incident and determine potentially if you have to notify or not. So these software have that logging capability that's going to be absolutely critical on the endpoint. And then we talk about phishing, a lot of phishing emails, so make sure that you've got a email security solutions that's going to look at making sure your emails cannot be spoofed. Colin talked about that email from the CEO that's not really from the CEO because the domain was spoofed. You know, it looked like it was sent by your CEO, but if you had that kind of protection in place, that would have been flagged and not delivered. A lot of the malware are also embedded in the email, so we want to make sure that these attachments are scanned, detonated in the sandbox before they can be delivered to your recipient. Also something to note here, and I'll talk about that a little bit later, in that DNS security. When you work from home, your web traffic, your network traffic, you don't have that visibility unless you're requiring your employees to connect back to the office via VPN. So what's really important to do is making sure that you can still have some visibility on where they go and prevent them from accessing malicious websites. A trend that we see from an investigation perspective is there's a category of sites that's called newly registered domain. And what the threat actors do, basically, they go and then they quickly register a new domain name that may look like your organization. So they could pick, for instance, Dean Dorton 1 or Dean Dorton with a 0 instead of an O. And then they set up a portal and they do a phishing campaign. If you don't filter that newly domain website, then that creates opportunities for threat actors to exploit that. So I talked about logging monitoring. It's really putting that together. Your endpoint traffic, email traffic, network traffic. Again, just thinking through the new landscape when you have remote workers. Do you have a way to manage and have visibility into these logs?
All right, and so going through all the things that Guy went through, those are all sort of technical controls. There's all a lot of non-technical, proactive things that you can and really need to be doing. So the first is data mapping, understanding where your data is, where your sensitive data is, putting that access control around it. So if someone is able to get into your system, they're not necessarily able to escalate into that sensitive information, the PII, the financial information, or the intellectual property. The next is a lot of states are now requiring a written information security plan. California, Massachusetts, the FTC, they all require that you have a plan so you've actually gone through your data, understood where it is, where that sensitive data is located, and the controls around that specific sensitive data, and those regulators can then ask for that plan. So one of the things as part of the data mapping exercise is data mapping plus a security plan so that you really understand how you're protecting that data, where it is, and update it, because you'll be shocked to learn that your information systems are ever evolving, and so making sure that your IT team is really paying attention to security. They spend most of their day just trying to make sure the system works, dealing with other issues. They're not always thinking about security. That needs to be sort of top of mind and make sure that someone within the IT staff, the CISO or someone else is really focused on security. The next is an incident response plan. These are critical. First of all, they're required, and the first question we always get when we speak to regulators after an event is, did you have an incident response plan and did you follow it? And they typically ask for a copy of it. The incident response plan really needs to work, and it really needs to be tailored to your organization. And what we really recommend is these tabletop exercises that Guy talked about to really think through, does this plan work for us? Are we escalating it appropriately? If we have an enterprise-wide event, or when do we get the CEO involved? When do we get the board involved? When do we go to law enforcement? How do we do that? Who's going to take responsibility? So for example, we had a client who had an event, was actually a bomb scare, an extortion event where they said, we're going to blow up 2 of your plants unless you give us X million in Bitcoin. It was a hoax, but you still have to evacuate your facilities, right? There was no real incident response plan for a situation like that because it was so far out of left field that they started, the number of phone calls that the CEO got, the CFO got, everyone else, it added to the chaos. So really working with your business continuity and disaster recovery team as part of your incident response team, because these threat actors are evolving and they're coming up with new ways to sort of create havoc. So really making sure that you have a holistic management level response plan so that you've got coordination. Otherwise, the chaos is something that the threat actors really try to leverage for profit. And again, I'm going to say it 3 or 4 times, these tabletops are invaluable. And then look at your insurance. I will tell you, the vast majority of our clients are wildly disappointed after an event when they look at their insurance and figure out what is or isn't covered. They just didn't pay attention to it because they said, oh, I have cyber, we're set. But the insurance industry is very good about excluding things or putting sublimits and things like that. So just make sure the coverage you have and make sure it's consistent with the risks that your organization faces. And the last is really look at your third-party vendors. A lot of them will have access to your systems. That's a penetration point, an access point that really could cause risk. You need to make sure that you're at a contractual level, making sure that they have minimum security requirements that match your requirements, and that you've got indemnity and other rights and audit rights and things like that, so that if they're the source of a breach, you have the ability to go back and recover some of that loss that's actually not caused by anything that you or your team did, but you can go to your vendors or other folks. And that gets to be a very complicated dance, particularly with large customers or large vendors or things like that. But it's really important, and ultimately your customers are going to look to you because my data may have been lost by your vendor, but they're going to still be looking to you, and they're going to make sure that you put those protections in place. So we're going to transition now to the incident response. So you've done all the protection you can. Like you said, it's not an issue of if, it's when it's going to happen, and so you need to sort of be ready for the incident response. And we're going to walk through an incident response and sort of go through the different issues from a technical standpoint and then a legal standpoint.
So what, if you don't have a plan in place, or if you're looking at trying to update your incident response plan, please look at the one from NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology. You cannot go wrong with NIST. They do have a lot of federal standards. They do have a template for a plan that kind of walks you through their process in great detail. The way it works is on that first phase, the preparation, it's all a matter of collecting that inventory. And Colin mentioned that, making sure that you know the system that you have, the data mapping, how the data flows, where it goes in the cloud. So trying to establish all of these systems, these inventories, this data flow, mapping, the control that you have, the alerts that you're going to collect, the logs that you're going to collect. And the goal of that first phase is to establish that baseline. So what a baseline looks like into your environment. So when your team reviews the log, then they can understand what that is, and if something doesn't look right, like I mentioned that antivirus alert for 2 weeks, then they can quickly react to a deviation from the baseline. So it is an inventory process. It's not just looking at the hardware, but it's looking at the data flow. It's making sure that you're collecting the right logs, so you know who is getting into your environment, what data they access, how they move, collecting that information into their systems that are meant to automate that process, that you've got a process to review and react to the alerts, and that your team, your IT team, understand that baseline. That detection and analysis is really that mode where you've got these constant monitoring processes in place to look for deviation against the baseline. So that if something happened, then we're moving to the third phase, that containment and eradication, where you're going to try to block the connections, the malicious connections trying to get in your network, or trying to extract data from your network, trying to isolate the systems that are in scope that might have been infected, compromised, that you're trying to protect that backup. You've got that loop here between that containment phase and that detection phase, so that you're trying to bring back your environment back into the baseline. So anything that deviates can be suspicious. Once you contain and eradicate, then you should go back to your baseline. And then NIST got that first phase, the post-incident, which is more of a root cause analysis, making sure that if we've missed something in the plan, we can update the plans to account for the event that we've just worked on. So that can also be applied to tabletop exercise. You don't have to have a real event to go through that. And what we do with clients is we introduce sometime a suspicious activity in the network to have this in real time. So we kind of understand how the IT team is going to react, how the incident response is going to play out, and we're helping organizations to document the outcome of that exercise. So if you suspect an incident, get your team in place right away. So first we talked about the technology considerations. And that's really a laundry list of things. I'm not going to go through that in detail, but really, when you suspect a data incident, you're going to call your cyber insurance, and they are going to sign a data breach coach to you, and they're going to try to have third party involved, a third party forensic team, a third party counsel that's going to guide you through that process. But what do you do in the meantime? It could be hours until that team is operational. You've got an incident going on, you need to know what to do. That's where your plan comes into play. There's two key takeaways here. The first thing is, do not change the state of the devices, and that's often a mistake that we see. People try to shut down things, reboot devices, do some kind of remediation, and by doing so, often they compromise the integrity of the investigation. Like if you shut down a system, for instance, everything that's in memory is going to disappear. And we know that in a lot of these modern threats that lead to ransomware, a lot of that activity is happening in memory. So we want to grab what's in memory. Now you can shut down the network, right? Because we don't want to have that threat to propagate. We don't want to have opportunities for the threat actors to extract your sensitive data. But if you suspect a device to be compromised, unplug from the network, leave that device alone, and then preserve the logs. I think I've said that a few times here, and that's another takeaway. Make sure you've got some kind of log management. We've seen situations where the firewall would overwrite its log every day or every few hours. The firewall logs, they are going to be a critical piece of the forensic investigation. They're going to determine, how much data maybe was exfiltrated, where it went, who accessed the data. And if you're not looking at that before, if you don't have a way to quickly extract these logs on a regular basis, when the forensic team is in place and try to investigate, they're going to miss some things. In your domain controllers, for instance, that's responsible for authentication and security activities within your computers. Often that security logs overwrites itself every few hours. So these are the two takeaways from that slide. While you wait from your forensic team, don't touch anything except unplugging the network. Of course, each situation is going to be different, but do what you can to preserve the security logs.
Okay. And building on what Guy just said, all of that should be in your incident response plan, because one of the biggest issues for us is when we, the lawyers, come on, and we typically come on either very shortly after the IT team is working to mitigate or restore the systems, or after Guy and his team have started their forensic review. If we don't preserve that information, remember, this is the scene of a crime, right? Ultimately, someone's broke into your system to try to steal something or to cause harm to your organization. Those steps, that's not the first thing your IT team is thinking about. Your IT team is thinking about, how do I get my systems back online? How do we get our people back working? They're not thinking about preservation. And preservation is incredibly important to the forensic team, but also to the potential litigation that comes, and also to the regulator inquiries that will come. So really making sure that you build in those pieces that Guy talked about, that is sort of a trap for the unwary. And so one of the first things that you will hear when we show up is, what have you preserved? We need to make sure we preserve everything. We actually start mirroring machines if it's a big enough issue, to make sure that we're really preserving all of that information, because without the logs and the other artifacts, we don't know what happened, and you ultimately sometimes have to default to, well, if we don't know what happened, then we have to notify everyone, and that's the worst case scenario, because you're telling your customers, your vendors, your regulators, well, we may have lost your data, but we don't know, but we're notifying you anyway, and that's a very awkward position to be in. So the preservation is really key, and making sure that's a critical first step and not something that missed. So we're going to transition to the legal considerations. The first is privilege, and one of the most important things, particularly when Guy and his team come into a forensic review, they're actually really figuring out what happened and what went wrong. That is a great roadmap for the plaintiff lawyers who may want to sue you. So you want to make sure that you've got privilege, and having counsel hire the forensic team when they go in and do that work. We're going to talk a little bit later about, there's a lot of attacks right now on the privilege over that work. You need to be very careful, and that's another trap for the unwary. But privilege early, because ultimately, you need to assume, as we're going to talk about later, that litigation will follow any breach, and at a minimum, you're going to have regulator inquiries. The next is internal and external communication. This is really complicated for any level of a breach, particularly if it's a ransomware event or a theft of information, because your employees are going to talk. All of our industries are fairly small. Word gets out very quickly. There are a lot of bloggers who talk about cyber incidents. It's amazing how fast employees start getting texts and other communications asking information about, hey, I heard there was an incident at your company. What's going on? Tell me about it. And a lot of people will respond, not understanding that the company needs to really manage that information. Particularly for a publicly traded company, is that material non-public information? This just gets really complicated very quickly. There are also a lot of issues that happen with these communications. Employees are going to be worried, is my information been taken? Your customers are going to be worried, was our IP taken? Your vendors are going to be worried about their information. So really how you manage those communications and the tone is really important, and you have to not overshare. One of the worst things we see is companies trying to be very, very transparent, but not having all the information, and they say, don't worry, your information wasn't impacted. He and his team come in, oh, well, the information was impacted. You need to then go out to your stakeholder and say, oh, I'm sorry, we were wrong. That just undermines the credibility of the response and your reputation. So really being very careful about the communications, and then Guy mentioned this, notify your carrier right away. A lot of the policies require that you put the carrier on notice. They may have panel counsel or other providers that they prefer to use. One thing I think that's important is speak with your broker and your carrier about identifying who you want to use. I think sometimes some of the folks that they give you, it's a volume practice. They don't really know you or your business. So really identifying who you want on your team before an event happens is really critical. So think about having that conversation with your carrier, because I will tell you that oftentimes, I'll just speak from ourselves, we often come in 3 or 4 days later because the client is very unhappy with the level of service they're getting from the firms that have been provided. And so the clients that we regularly do business with say, we tried to go with the insurance folks, and they're just not giving us the level of service that we want. That doesn't happen all the time, but it happens with some regularity. And so making sure you're getting the level of service and people who know you and understand how important it is, because basically someone's just dropped a bomb in the middle of your lobby and you're trying to pick it up and get your business back going. You need to make sure you've got people who are committed and that you can fully trust. So in terms of the investigation, Guy is tired of me saying this, okay, what was accessed and what was exfiltrated? Until we understand the scope and nature of the event, we really can't figure out what the legal obligations are. So we spent a lot of time trying to understand how did the individual threat actors, how the individuals get in, where did they go within the network, and what did they have access to, and did they exfiltrate any information? That is not that easy to figure out, because oftentimes the threat actors are trying to destroy logs, cover their tracks, all sorts of other things within the network. That's why that preservation piece is so important. Preserve everything you can, because the threat actors are very sophisticated at covering their tracks. And so we need every artifact and every log that we can get our hands on to really put the story back together. And it's almost an art more even, and a science at the same time. But if any unauthorized third party had access to information like your HR files or your customer lists or anything else like that, there are disclosure obligations that happen. They don't have to exfiltrate it, they just have unauthorized third-party access. That triggers a disclosure obligation in all 50 states, as well as in Europe and many other countries around the world. You need to understand where the residents of those individuals are, and it becomes a very complicated analysis in terms of disclosures. We've had situations where we've had to provide notification in over 50 countries, including all 50 states. So you're dealing with all of those different regulators around the world and all of the different regulators in the US, and they all have very high expectations, and they all want information very quickly. And if you say, well, we don't know what happened, we don't have the logs, they're gonna start putting pressure on you to provide notification to everyone. Again, look at your third-party contracts, make sure that you've got some rights there. Data mining. One of the other issues is once they get into your system, they're not looking at structured data, they're looking at unstructured data. So we actually have to go back and understand what data was in your systems. Oftentimes in share drives and things like this, you will find enormous amounts of PII the HR folks have a spreadsheet of some analysis they did that ended up on a shared drive that you didn't need anymore but was there. We had one client who had to notify over 100,000 people because they had a spreadsheet that someone put together 5 years ago and they just left in a shared drive that was unsecured. And unfortunately, that was some of the data that was accessed. And so a little bit of data management, data governance is really important so that if they get in, they can't get access to things that require notification. All of this sounds really easy, it's not. So really sort of taking the time to understand your data, do the data mapping, do the data security, get rid of stale data that you don't need and secure it. If it's encrypted, password protected, ultimately you don't need to provide notification. There's a safe harbor in all 50 states if it's encrypted. So encrypt HR data, encrypt customer data. That's really a critical first step, but that's part of that data hygiene and the security mapping. And then if there is a breach and there is exfiltration or notification, you need to provide notification to the attorney generals and other regulatory bodies depending on the nature of that data. So if it's export control data, you need to provide notice to state or commerce. If it's defense related information under the DFAR, you have 72 hours to provide notification to the DoD. If it's information regarding a European citizen, you have 72 hours to provide notice to those data protection regulators in Europe. So there's really tight timelines, and ultimately, once you've provided notification to any of those regulators, there will be follow-up conversations and lots of questions. And then you also have to send notices to those specific individuals. So, and one of the hardest things is sending notifications to former potentially disgruntled employees who then go visit a plaintiff's lawyer and decide that this might be an opportunity. So there's a lot of things that really can become very difficult very quickly, and there's a lot of pressure in trying to get your business back up and running, dealing with your legal obligations, getting your IT system back up and running, and really dealing with it. So a lot of the prevention that Guy talked about pays huge dividends in terms of the speed that you can respond and also minimizing the scale of the attack and the loss of information. And then the forensic report is ultimately critical because it's going to be important in terms of what you can tell your regulators, your defense to the litigation, but again, it details all of the things that went wrong to allow the attack to occur. That's a gift to the plaintiff's firms. So you need to be, and to the regulators if they decide to open an investigation. So we're going to talk about this a little later, but be very careful about privilege and don't share that forensic report beyond the core team, because once it's shared and when it loses that confidentiality, that document will be used against you and it'll be exhibit A, B, and C in any investigation or litigation. So on post-incident, after the incident, it's an opportunity to learn. So do a root cause analysis. What went wrong? Is it a systemic issue? Did we not have gaps? You know, for example, we had one client who had two internet-facing servers, one of which got patched, one of which didn't. You can guess which server was the source of the intrusion to the network. It's just little things like that that can happen. So just making sure there's process, like he said, process-driven approach to security, making sure that all, that gaps don't happen just because human error. Humans make mistakes, we know that. Try to build in as much process and controls and redundancy. But then also if there's another root cause where you've got an insider who maybe is selling information to attackers or someone using, we had one issue where everyone in the company was using Happy Halloween 1234, and actually that was brute force and attacked, and they actually compromised over 300 employees' emails just like that. That attack went very quickly and easily. So ultimately being really careful about passwords and strong passwords and really doing all those things pay huge dividends, because if you can protect the perimeter before they get in, that's great. That's your first line of defense. And then once they get in, having all the controls Guy talked about is helpful. And then make sure your policies and procedures are updated. Update your incident response plan. We always suggest doing sort of a debrief on how did the incident response plan work? Was it helpful? Was it not helpful? Where did it work? Where didn't work? And really updating it, and then ultimately, doing a tabletop again afterwards with that fresh in everyone's mind, so we really can do better the next time. But this is, again, an ongoing process, something that you should be doing regularly, but these tabletops pay huge dividends as we're moving forward. So next, I've talked a lot about litigation, and I think the trend here really is litigation is increasing dramatically. This is a focus for the plaintiff's bar. And the real big issues here are actual harm and what is reasonable security. Those are the two issues that are sort of shaping litigation right now. In terms of trying to really understand the issue of actual harm, if you have 3,000 people's PII stolen, is that harm? Is that something that a court can actually provide a recovery for? And there's an enormous amount of litigation around this issue and whether there's a legal harm that a court can provide a remedy to. So that's called standing. And so there's lots of fights with respect to standing. Is there actual harm? The plaintiffs' law firms have been very active in trying to create that injury in any way that they can, even if they can't prove that this data was used for identity theft. Because if your data was stolen 10 times, how can you prove that this incident was the one that caused the harm to the individuals? Or if there's been no identity theft, is there really any harm? Well, a lot of people would argue that, yes, it's my information, it's been compromised, of course I've been harmed. And that's sort of the fight that the courts have been dealing with. One issue, the Supreme Court just again reaffirmed that the risk of injury is not sufficient harm, so the plaintiff's bar has to prove something more. And then what they fall back on, did you actually maintain reasonable security in your system? Were you negligent in the way you protected my information? And we all know one person's reasonable is another person's unreasonable, and so it creates real significant fights. And so if you have the planning and things like that to demonstrate an objectively reasonable security plan, you're in a much better position to respond to a litigation or regulator inquiry. So there's a lot of circuit splits. There's actually a lot of dispute between the different courts about what is harm. And ultimately, you've got courts that are sort of trying to find this middle approach that if it's may not be actual harm, but if it's clear that someone used a portion of the data in this data set, then maybe that's enough. Or if the plaintiffs had to go out and buy cyber insurance or identity theft protection, that's enough of a harm. Or that it caused anxiety and therefore, so there's just lots of ways that plaintiffs are really trying to create that hook so they can stay in court and create that leverage for moving forward and trying to exact a settlement. So one way that states are dealing with this, particularly because there are some judges that are very receptive to the idea that there is a harm assumed when your data is lost. A number of states, and particularly California, have gone even farther and basically created statutory damages. So every time your data is lost, or a resident of California's data is lost, they have a cause of action if they can demonstrate that you failed to take reasonable security procedures. Now, we're going to talk about in a second, that's not defined in the statute. So what is reasonable? So it sort of creates an automatic cause of action. And it's liquidated damages for 100 to 750 per incident per person. So if you have a number of sets of data that could compromise in an incident, you can multiply that 2 or 3 times per each individual, and you can get into once you start doing the math, it can get extraordinarily expensive very quickly. And they're also modifying the California Consumer Privacy Act to require implementation of reasonable security measures. So they created another duty on behalf of companies to really do this. And then you have to document it. And then the California Data Protection Authority can come in and say, what are your policies? You have to disclose as individuals. And so it just creates another avenue for potential claims, both from a regulator standpoint and from a plaintiff standpoint. So what is reasonable security? So this is something we end up fighting about a lot, and that's why really having those detailed plans about your security assessment, your penetration testing, your security assessments, all of those things, your written plans and your procedures really helps defend these types of claims. But it's not defined in the statute. Actually, the best definition is in the 2016 data breach report that was published by then California AG, who's now Vice President Kamala Harris. And really, basically, it came down to security as a process. It's based on standards, so the NIST standard that Guy talked about, multi-factor authentication, and encryption. So, but again, that's a very loose definition. It's a 76-page report. I distilled it down into 4 basic points. But that's really what California is going to be looking for in terms of those types of pieces. But this is a very new area. For example, the first FCPA settlement came out in 2020. they only paid each individual $2. So why would anyone file a lawsuit for $2? They didn't. It was because the plaintiff lawyers took a very large fee for bringing the suit. So the driver isn't the loss to the individuals, it's that the plaintiff's bar can create very significant fees by saying, I got recovery for 4 million people, I should be paid several $1 million in legal fees. Now, while the plaintiff's bar will rely very heavily on statutory causes of action, they will assert a number of other causes of action just to stay in court so they can create that leverage for settlement. And we actually, for a client, we had a fairly large data breach for about 3 million individuals. Within 24 hours, we had 4 lawsuits that were filed in 4 different states, and there were 12 different causes of action. And the complaints were remarkably similar because I think the plaintiff's bar is sharing their templates, because the first to file ultimately gets benefits in terms of the amounts that they can recover in attorney's fees. So there's a race to the courthouse in these cases, and so you need to be ready that you're going to get multiple lawsuits in multiple jurisdictions, similar but different, and then ultimately there's going to be a lot of jockeying as to where the case is going to proceed, and obviously defendants prefer certain jurisdictions versus others. So this is the first trend, is really the plaintiff lawyers are really creative and really aggressive, and they try to generate negligence-based claims because it's very hard for you to get those thrown out as a matter of law, because the question is, were you factually, did you meet your duty of care with respect to that information? And what is appropriate security standards may vary. That's why using the standards and the process that Guy talked about gives you an objective basis to say, yes, we were reasonable in our approach and how we were handling the data. And then ultimately moving very quickly to the standing piece, that was there actually any harm? If you've got control over your sensitive data and you can show that the sensitive data was not impacted, that maybe it was only address and name, but the social security number, the bank account, the credit card information, that wasn't compromised because it was encrypted or tokenized or something like that, you can say, not only was our security reasonable, but there was no real harm here. And that's the way that you can really defend these suits, but you have to have all of that done well in advance of the breach. Otherwise, you're in a position where the plaintiff lawyers will be able to get past a motion for summary judgment. They shift a lot of the burden onto your company, and then ultimately they work very hard to get a settlement to generate those fees. The second trend is, because the forensic report is basically what went wrong and how this information got out, there's been a huge amount of litigation right now trying to challenge the privilege over forensic reports, and courts coming back and saying that because it was contracted by the IT team or because it was paid out of the IT budget, it's really part of the business response, not the legal response, and therefore it's not privileged. So what you need to do is make sure you stop, make sure that Guy and his team or the forensic team is engaged through counsel. Typically outside counsel is better than inside counsel just because there's that level of independence. Make sure it comes out of the legal budget and that it's for purposes of defending anticipated litigation or regulatory inquiries. And you need to make sure that you're very formalistic about that, document that objectively, and then limit the sphere of people who are interacting with the forensic team and who ultimately has access to that forensic work. And you should be able to keep it clearly within that privilege bubble. But if you don't do that and you make some of these mistakes because you're moving so quickly to respond, and your IT team just reaches out to whomever they can and pulls them in, the likelihood is it will be discoverable and then used against your company. And that's been the trend of the case law. The courts have been trying to find reasons why these reports, these forensic reports, are not privileged. So you got to be really careful, and that's again a trap for the unwary. Be very careful about how you move forward with the forensic engagement and handling the report. So that sort of completes our overview of the litigation. Hopefully this has been helpful, and obviously if you have any questions, Guy and I are happy to answer them now or separately after. But thank you for your time, and hopefully this was interesting and helpful. All right, well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
We appreciate it.
Thanks.